Softwar by Jason P. Lowery, produced by Parker Banks at pbanks.net and youtube.com/pbanks. Chapter 4. Power Projection Tactics in Human Society. Man cannot remake himself without suffering, for he is both the marble and the sculptor. Alex Carrel. Introduction. So long as there are men, there will be wars. Albert Einstein. Organisms fight and kill each other for their resources. This struggle is real and directly observable. But when evaluating human behavior, there are clear differences between the way sapiens behave and the way other organisms behave, particularly in the way they fight and kill each other for resources. Behaviorally, modern sapiens are unique in the animal kingdom in that they fight and kill each other not just for resources, but also for what they chose to believe in. They use their powerful brains to think abstractly, adopt belief systems that other organisms are physiologically incapable of perceiving, and then they physically compete over those belief systems at unrivaled scale. Ironically, amongst the most commonly adopted belief systems over which humans routinely fight and kill each other is the belief that people shouldn't have to fight for their resources, that sapiens and sapiens alone have natural rights to their lives, liberties and properties which other animals don't have, and that humans are special exceptions to primordial phenomena like predation, entropy, and the existential necessity to establish dominance hierarchies. It is not uncommon for modern humans to believe that the creator of life itself has placed them on a special pedestal above all the other life forms on Earth, so that they don't have to struggle the same as the rest of the life forms beneath them to settle their intraspecies property disputes, establish control authority over intraspecies resources, and determine the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of their property. In this chapter, the author will break down concepts around human power projection and conflict to their core and offer some explanations for why humans behave the way they do, particularly how and why modern human societies are routinely compelled to fight and kill each other over their resources and belief systems. This will build conceptual insight about why humans fight wars, which will develop the conceptual foundation for why Bitcoin might be used not as a monetary technology, but as a soft, aka non-kinetic warfighting technology that physically empowers people to physically fight and physically compete for their resources and for what they choose to believe in, but in a non-lethal way that doesn't physically harm others. Now that we have a foundational understanding about how and why organisms use physical power to settle intraspecies disputes and establish dominance hierarchies, we turn our attention to human beings. One of the remarkable things that make behaviorally modern sapiens stand out in nature is that they deliberately try not to use physical power as the basis for settling their disputes and establishing their pecking order. Instead, they use their imaginations to conceive of abstract sources of power, and then they attempt to use these abstract sources of power to settle their disputes and establish their pecking order. These attempts often don't succeed, hence the phenomenon called warfare. As much as humans wish they could cheat nature and establish their dominance hierarchies using something which transcends physics, they have yet to transcend warfare. They still rely on physical power to enforce or defend abstract power. Human infighting may be the most physically destructive intraspecies competition on the planet. For some reason, no matter how much sapiens try not to use physical power to settle their disputes and establish their dominance hierarchies, they resort back to the same primordial behavior as practically every other species in nature. This chapter explains how and why humans attempt to use abstract sources of power to settle their intraspecies disputes, establish their dominance hierarchies, determine who has control authority over their resources, and achieve consensus on the legitimate state and chain of custody of their property. To do this, the author begins by guiding the reader through a deep dive in human metacognition and abstract thinking. Once a baseline understanding in human metacognition has been established, the author explores the differences between abstract and physical power, how abstract power-based dominance hierarchies work in comparison to the physical power-based resource control structures discussed in the previous chapters, and explores why they break down and lead humans repeatedly back to war. The purpose of this chapter is to establish a thorough understanding of the root causes of warfare in order to develop the why behind emerging power projection technologies like Bitcoin that the author asserts could theoretically serve as an extension of warfare for human society as it enters the digital age. But before introducing the concept of soft war and entering into a discussion about the socio-technical and national strategic security implications of Bitcoin as a war-fighting protocol rather than strictly a monetary protocol, it's necessary to understand how and why wars break out in the first place. Warfare is a difficult and trans-scientific topic that is emotionally and politically charged. It's impossible to really know how and why wars break out, but the author provides some explanations for why they do based off concepts which emerge from data coding. The point of this discussion is to offer thorough conceptual insights into why humans can't seem to not fight wars. In other words, the reader should leave this chapter with an understanding for why society's peaceful alternatives to settling intraspecies property disputes and establishing pecking order routinely break down and become dysfunctional, and why humans keep having to return to the primordial behavior of fighting and killing each other to establish decentralized, zero trust, and permissionless control over their valuable resources. Once the reader understands why humans keep resorting back to fighting and killing each other over resources like wild animals do, the author proceeds into a discussion about the dynamics of national strategic security. This leads to an exploration of how and why humans have scaled their physical power projection tactics to the point of mutually assured destruction, and why this situation represents a major systemic security hazard. The chapter concludes with a discussion about how humans would benefit from their own version of antlers, which would allow them to settle their disputes and establish their pecking order using non-kinetic, thus non-lethal, physical power projection tactics, techniques, and technologies. Human behavior could be described as ironic because in their attempts to avoid intraspecies infighting and transcend uncivilized physical power-based methods of resource control, they have become amongst the most physically destructive mammals on the planet. This chapter attempts to provide some explanations for why this destruction takes place, so that these concepts can be utilized later to explain the context about why people would be motivated to use Bitcoin as a war-fighting technology, and how Bitcoin could help people mitigate warfare's destructive effects. A whole new world. The true sign of intelligence is not knowledge, but imagination. Albert Einstein. Firepower equals computing power. Brain tissue requires about 20 times more power than muscle tissue. The most energy-consuming part of our brain is the modern part, the neocortex, which is used for higher-level processing and abstract thinking. For shrew-like mammals, the neocortex represents about 10% of total brain volume. The average mammal's brain volume is 40% neocortex. Primates have an above-average neocortex volume of 50%. But even a primate's neocortex is small compared to anatomically modern humans. A staggering 80% of sapient brain volume is neocortex. Humans can afford to power their large neocortices because of the energy abundance they achieved by learning how to control fire. Humans unlock far more energy per unit of food consumed than other animals thanks to their ability to cook. Just like a staged combustion cycle on a modern rocket can unlock more energy for relatively little penalty in size, weight, and power by using a pre-burner to combust fuel and oxidizer before it reaches the combustion chamber, humans operate the same way. By cooking their food, humans pre-burn their fuel as a form of pre-digestion before it reaches their combustion chamber, stomachs, allowing them to unlock substantially more energy per unit of food with only a minor penalty to size, weight, and power. And just like how more energy allows a rocket to carry more payload on top of it, more energy allows a human to carry more payload on top of it too. Humans enjoyed a step function rise in surplus energy when they took control of fire, which they vectored towards performing the highly energy-intensive task of thinking. The brain represents only about 2% of a modern human's body weight, yet it consumes about 20% of its energy. Fortunately, humans became so rich in surplus energy that they were able to habitually overclock their neocortices to the point where it drove dramatic physiological changes, giving rise to the modern sapiens' massive neocortices and oddly bulbous heads. Learning how to control fire and gain access to exogenous energy caused sapient brains to grow so quickly that they outpaced the growth of their own pelvises and birth canals. Combined with their tendency to walk upright, these sudden anatomical changes caused sapiens to have far more complex and painful childbirths than other primates. Sapient heads are so large that they must be born approximately 50% prematurely with only partially assembled skulls and necks, just to fit through their mother's birth canal. For this reason, sapiens are significantly more fragile and helpless at birth compared to other mammals, and they must go through a longer adolescent period to account for having to incubate outside the womb. But as the saying goes, the juice is worth the squeeze. A sapien's massive neocortex is the source of the most significant power projection technique observed on Earth. Using imagination to create a virtual reality, anatomically modern sapiens and their absurdly large foreheads emerged from Africa at least 200,000 to 300,000 years ago and expanded into Europe as the ice melted. Despite their physiological similarities, sapiens don't appear to have behaved like the ones today until the Upper Paleolithic era started around 50,000 years ago. This is when the fossil record first starts showing signs of sapiens having a higher degree of intentionality and theory of mind required for the highly self-consciousness behavior of modern humans, a phenomenon often called behavioral modernity. It was during this time frame when sapiens started tracing their hands on cave walls and signaling extraordinarily high levels of self-consciousness compared to other animals. They started making distinctions between themselves and their environment with both objective and abstract qualities. It's unclear what exactly caused human consciousness to spark, but when it did, it appears to have spread quickly. Charles Foster describes the change as follows. Something tectonic happened to human consciousness in the Upper Paleolithic, whether by revolution or revelation or evolution. A new type of consciousness emerged out of or in addition to or in substitution for the consciousness that had been there before. For however long it had been gestating, a new type of self-perception and self-understanding had burst. It was manifested in a new symbolic sense, so much better at expressing itself that it looked different in kind or degree from anything that had existed before. It should be noted that sapiens are first and foremost hunter-gathering nomads, having spent only the last 5% of their history on Earth doing anything except traveling the world searching for fauna and flora to eat. Their overclocked, overpowered, and oversized neocortices are especially useful for these activities because they help their hosts perform advanced pattern finding. The ability to connect dots between sensory input information enhances sapiens' ability to detect and exploit patterns of behavior in surrounding fauna and flora for improved hunting and gathering. The advanced dot-connecting and pattern-finding capability of a brain is colloquially known as intelligence. The more an animal can use their brain to connect dots between their sensory inputs or detect valid patterns of behavior within their environment, the more intelligent the animal is perceived to be. Not surprisingly, with 80% of their brain volume comprised of advanced pattern-finding neocortex hardware fueled by excess energy and firepower, modern sapient brains are the most intelligent on Earth. Sapient brains are so effortlessly good at dot connecting and pattern finding that they don't even need physical sensory inputs. It is possible to put a behaviorally modern human in a dark, empty, sound-dead room, and their brain will have no trouble envisioning many sights, sounds, and objects. They will connect dots between sensory inputs which don't exist and detect patterns which don't exist. This remarkable capability is known as abstract thinking. Imagination could be described as the phenomenon which occurs when human neocortices use their abstract thinking skills to form ideas, images, or concepts independently and without physical sensory inputs. This thesis uses the term imaginary to describe phenomena detected by human brains which don't physically exist in shared objective reality. Imaginary patterns can occur either due to a false correlation to physical sensory inputs, or because the pattern was formed without sensory inputs in the first place. The author acknowledges there are detailed fields of philosophy with far more detailed and varying definitions of imaginary. This is how the author will use the term throughout this thesis. Because of their ability to think abstractly and find imaginary patterns, sapiens operate in two different realities simultaneously, one in front of their eyes and one behind them. The author defines the concrete reality in front of a human's eyes as objective physical reality, the domain of energy, matter, space, and time which precedes humans and produces our physical sensory inputs. This reality is shared by all humans, regardless of whether they can detect or conceive of it. Moreover, physically objective reality exists in and of itself, although sapiens technically can't process it objectively without the abstract biases caused by their own brains. The reality behind a human's eyes can be defined as subjective abstract reality, a non-physical domain constructed out of the abstract thoughts of sapient neocortices and filled with imaginary patterns like symbols and semantic meaning. This reality can either be exclusive to one human mind, or it can be combined with other human minds. This means abstract reality can either be an individual reality, or it can be a shared reality, where the latter occurs when sapiens get other people to see and believe in the same abstract reality together. No other species on Earth appears to be able to perceive abstract reality except for sapiens. It is possible that other animals simply aren't physically capable of it because they don't have enough brainpower and neurological circuitry needed to think of abstract reality. For the purposes of this thesis, abstract reality is defined as a new, imaginary world that recently emerged within the last 0.001% of life's total time on Earth. Abstract reality is unique to humans alone, the only animal to have survived the evolutionary journey and prospered enough to have the capacity to think of it. The author acknowledges there are detailed fields of philosophy, theology, ideology, phenomenology, and metaphysics with far more detailed and varying definitions of these terms. This is how the author will use the term throughout this thesis. Juggling these two different realities at the same time is quite an energy-intensive burden for human brains to bear, so to make it more efficient, sapiens show extreme favoritism towards their subjective, abstract, and imaginary reality. Then, they superimpose their abstract and imaginary beliefs onto sensory inputs seen, smelled, tasted, touched, and heard from objective physical reality. Brains appear to have no way of knowing if a detected pattern is anything but abstract when it's first generated, so they rely on their hosts to cross-reference their abstract thoughts against physical sensory inputs to determine if the imaginary pattern is a physically real pattern. More on this in the next section. The way human brains think is noteworthy for two reasons. First, it suggests humans experience the world foremost through their imaginations, then determine what is real based off what imaginary patterns happen to correspond to matching sensory inputs. Second, it suggests sapiens use abstract thinking in both directions of data processing for dual purposes. Brains process physical inputs from objective physical reality at the same time they generate abstract beliefs about physical reality for the senses to investigate. These two separate tasks occur simultaneously all the time. Human minds produce a mental model of the world which influences the way they think, act, and perceive the information they receive back from their senses. Brains therefore act like a lens through which sapiens understand the world in abstract reality, while simultaneously acting as the mechanism through which they shape the world in objective reality. This bi-directional feedback and dual-use type of abstract thinking, where the brain's imagination influences the processing of its physical sensory data inputs as well as its outputs, appears to be the key enabling skill set required for a phenomenon called symbolism. The author acknowledges there are detailed fields of psychology with far more detailed and varying definitions of symbolism. This is how the author will use the term throughout this thesis. Humans are so skilled at using their habitually over-energized brains to perform bidirectional and dual-use abstract thinking that it happens automatically without being conscious of it. It appears to be extraordinarily difficult for humans to turn off this behavior unless the brain becomes physically damaged or chemically impaired. It's practically impossible for humans not to distort their senses with their abstract thoughts or act purely off experiential knowledge. That is, knowledge gained based exclusively off sensory inputs without biasing those inputs with our own subjective and abstract thoughts. Ironically, this implies humans can't do what other animals can do effortlessly, experience objective physical reality for what it is, without skewing sensory inputs through a neocortical lens of abstract biases. Whereas most non-human species can't perceive symbols and abstract meaning in the first place, sapiens can't not perceive symbolic patterns and abstract meaning once a given pattern has been committed to memory. The reader is invited to test this out. Try to look at this page without detecting symbols like letters and words, or try to listen to someone produce the audible wave pattern of your name without detecting that abstract concept called your name. Most people find this to be impossible, except for people drugged, brain-damaged, or experiencing severe memory loss. Another way to show how difficult it is to not think symbolically is to look at the figure below, which depicts random lines arranged with no structure contrasted against the same lines structured to produce a cross, a star, or words. The blue and black scribbles drawn above and below the grey dashed line are identical in every way, except for their topology. Simply change their topology and, like magic, a bunch of nonsensical and objectively meaningless scribbles suddenly turn into something with rich symbolic meaning, even though the only thing that changed was the topology of the scribbles. If you don't see the same objectively meaningless scribbles above and below the grey line, then you are guilty of applying abstract symbolic meaning to something that is objectively meaningless. Technically speaking, the scribbles drawn above and below the dashed line are equally meaningless, but you can't see it that way because you have committed the topological patterns below the grey dashed line to memory as symbols denoting semantically and syntactically complex abstract meaning. That's how gifted sapient brains are at abstract thinking. You don't even have to try, and you can't turn it off. You are slave to your neocortex, incapable of not perceiving symbolic patterns and imaginary meaning which directly interfere with how you process physical sensory inputs and how you perceive the shared objective physical reality we're living in. How to detect if something is real. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Lucius Annaeus Seneca, Sapiens, struggle to detect what's real. There are dedicated fields of knowledge like psychology, phenomenology, and metaphysics devoted to the subject of understanding what real means. It turns out real is a surprisingly difficult thing for sapiens to define because, as demonstrated in the previous example, our objective sensory inputs are tainted by the subjective abstract thoughts and interpretations of our big, fat, overpowered, hyperactive, and overclocked brains. Sapiens are effectively trapped behind a neocortical cage, unable to interpret the world objectively for what it is without skewing it with imaginary meaning and symbolism. This makes it exceptionally difficult to know what real is. Therefore, for the sake of producing a simple argument, this thesis uses the word real as a synonym for physical and the terms imaginary or abstract as synonyms for non-physical. The author acknowledges that what we call physics is technically an experiential process mediated by the brain's abstractions and therefore not mutually exclusive to or divisible from abstract thoughts. However, for lack of better words to describe ontologically precedent, exogenous and distinct phenomena like time, mass, space and energy which predate sapiens by nearly 14 billion years, This is how the author will use the term real throughout the remainder of this thesis. Real things, according to the author, are categorized as things which produce their own physical signature in the domain of shared objective physical reality, as best as we currently understand what that means. On the contrary, imaginary things can be categorized as things which aren't real and therefore don't produce their own physical signature in the domain of shared objective physical reality. The author understands that subject matter experts in the fields of knowledge devoted to studying what real means don't make this same non-physical versus physical distinction. He apologizes in advance to professional philosophers for an engineer's bias towards physics and asks for temporary indulgence for the sake of illustrating a point. As discussed in the previous section, a human brain's advanced bidirectional and dual-use abstract processing is done automatically and subconsciously without requiring control inputs from a human host. Imaginary patterns are produced up front, then cross-referenced with sensory inputs received from shared objective reality to determine if a given pattern is real or unreal. Because of the physical constraints associated with receiving sensory inputs, namely the fact that a human can't be everywhere and see, smell, touch, taste, and hear everything all the time, it's far easier for the brain to produce imaginary patterns than it is for the brain to physically verify them by cross-referencing them with the body's sensory inputs. The former only requires imaginary or symbolically gained knowledge, for example, knowledge gained from activities like thinking or reading or looking at a computer screen, whereas the latter requires experiential knowledge, for example, knowledge gained by collecting physical signals through the body's sensory organs. This is an important distinction to make because it means a strong majority of what humans think they know hasn't been physically verified or cross-referenced by their own sensory organs. Additionally, this algorithm is fully automated and subconscious, so sapiens are often not even aware of the fact they do it. In other words, most of what sapiens know about the world is derived completely from symbolism and the imagination, not from what they can directly physically experience through their senses. And they commonly don't realize there's even a difference between these two different types of knowledge. Most people get their information about the world from interpretations presented on TV screens or computer screens, that is symbolic knowledge, rather than from actually experiencing the world firsthand, that is experiential knowledge. Note how the term firsthand implies that information gained or learned directly must directly come from physical sensory organs like hands. So much of what sapiens experience is imaginary compared to what they can physically validate using sensory inputs, that they simply forget the fact that much of what they believe is physically unverified. This would explain why it's so easy for sapiens to be psychologically manipulated. It's easy to lose sight of the difference between objective reality and abstract reality without devoting a non-trivial amount of brain power towards understanding metacognition. It should therefore come as no surprise that sapient brains produce a lot of false positive beliefs about objective reality which go completely undetected. The way sapiens think appears to be a highly effective survival tactic. Humans may be trapped behind a cage of symbolism from which they can't escape, but the disadvantages of being stuck behind a prefrontal cortex where no conscious distinction is made between real, aka physical, and imaginary, that is non-physical things, is offset by some major advantages of abstract thinking. One advantage of abstract thinking is that it helps people with advanced pattern finding and detecting threats. As an example, consider a human walking through the woods. If the eyes detect some sticks, the sapient brain can utilize its advanced pattern finding and abstract thinking skills to produce an imaginary image of a snake. Because the imaginary image of a snake can be cross-referenced to a visual input of sticks gained from physical reality, the brain can produce a false correlation about realness. Unaware of the fact that the snake isn't real, the brain's host will take quick and decisive maneuvers to avoid what could be a serious threat. This example illustrates a scenario where the brain's realness verification algorithm produced a false positive correlation. It turns out False positive correlations about the realness of imaginary patterns are useful in a dangerous world filled with predators because it results in a tendency to err on the side of caution. It's better for survival to produce false positive beliefs about the realness of a threat than to fail to detect a true threat. Because of this instinctive programming, even when sapiens are metacognitively aware of the fact that they can't verify what they are experiencing is something physically real, they will still weigh it highly, or even more important than what their sensory inputs can physically verify. Likewise, even when sapiens are metacognitively aware of the fact that the source of the sensory input isn't the same as the abstract input, they will still falsely correlate it. This is one of the reasons why it's so easy to scare people using fictional stories like horror movies. Even when we consciously know that the threat isn't real because it's on a movie screen, we can still feel afraid about what we witness for days after watching a scary movie. This phenomenon also explains why large populations are quick to believe that high-ranking people, for example monarchs, presidents, etc., are powerful people. We falsely correlate the abstract or symbolic power exercised by a king to the real or physical power exercised by the king's army. Much more on this in the following sections. The bottom line is, it's simply more efficient and easier on the brain to assume imaginary things are real because it saves a substantial amount of energy-intensive thinking power and because it results in false positive correlations which are beneficial for survival. Recalling the lesson on survivorship bias from Chapter 4, it is reasonable to believe there were plenty of early brains which weren't as instinctively inclined to favor abstract inputs over sensory inputs or quick to produce false positive beliefs about the realness of imaginary patterns. However, their resulting lack of producing false positive beliefs would have made their hosts more complacent, less cautious, and less responsive to genuine threats. In other words, they were less likely to survive. Therefore, the reason why humans constantly struggle to distinguish between imaginary things versus real things could simply be explained by natural selection. The tendency to believe in imaginary things leads to a higher probability of surviving real threats and consequently passing on one's genes. Fast forward over hundreds of thousands of years, and here we are today, routinely making false positive correlations between real and imaginary things because that's what survives. Sapiens have so much thinking power and are so inclined to believe imaginary things are real that they behave unlike any other animal on Earth. They strongly and passionately believe in things they have never seen, smelled, heard, tasted, or touched. They act, react, and show extreme favoritism towards symbols and operate either oblivious to or consciously unconcerned with the difference between abstract things and physical things. They will respond to stimuli which exist nowhere except within their imagination, more often and far more passionately than information received by their sensory inputs from physically objective reality. They will ignore their experiential knowledge altogether and act strictly according to symbolic knowledge, often not even aware of the fact that they're doing it. They will stop paying attention to the fact that they're sitting down and doing practically nothing because they are entranced in an abstract world spoken or written into existence by a stranger using a complex written language. If you're reading this, look around for a second and realize that you're just sitting still, doing nothing but staring at symbols. Sapiens, unlike any other animal, can and will subject themselves to a great deal of struggle, suffering, and personal sacrifice for reasons which don't exist anywhere except within their collective imaginations. They will adopt belief systems and participate in population-scale consensual hallucinations, grateful for the opportunity to labor their entire lives over imaginary things, and even to die for them. This is a defining feature of the human experience. Proof of power is proof of real. Pinch me because I must be dreaming, origin unknown. We have now established that sapient neocortices are so effortlessly skilled at abstract thinking that sapiens struggle to know what real is, and thanks to natural selection, they constantly make false positive correlations between imaginary things and real things. Because of this, humans need workarounds or protocols they can use to help them distinguish between imaginary things and real things. For situations where sapiens struggle to distinguish between real and imaginary and desire to know if what they are experiencing is real, many subscribe to an adaptation of the realness verification protocol. Whenever sapiens wonder or doubt if an object is physically real or not, the commonly accepted protocol is to attempt to manually generate the physical sensory inputs needed to cross-reference the brain's abstract input with a physical sensory input. A very common way of doing this is by poking or pinching something to generate haptic feedback for their touch sensory organ. It's a simple and effective protocol. Not sure if an object is real? Try poking it. Not sure if an experience is real? Try pinching yourself. Pinching is especially useful during special occasions when the neocortex is busy producing very convincing imaginary patterns, but the host is deprived of the physical sensory inputs from objective physical reality it needs to cross-reference inputs and attempt to validate realness. This often happens when a human is sleeping or when operating in a dream-like environment like cyberspace. Hence why haptic feedback systems are popular, such as vibrating video game controllers. Note how the act of poking or pinching something involves the application of force to displace mass. If the object is real, then a human knows from experience and from reading Newton that an equal and opposite force will displace the mass of their hand. Likewise, if the event is real, then the force used to pinch the skin will cause neuroreceptors to detect the displacement. What the brain is doing in these situations is manually generating the sensory inputs needed to cross-reference its abstract thoughts with physical sensory inputs to help make it easier to decide if an object or event is real. Here the reader should note how this protocol requires physical power to work. What's another name for the displacement of mass with force? Power. Therefore, what's another name for the act of using power to prove that something is real? Proof of power. When a human pokes or pinches something, they apply a force to a mass over time and displace it across space. In other words, they're projecting physical power. Why is projecting power in this way useful? Because power is comprised of the concrete phenomenon of objective physical reality, energy, mass, time, and space. It is impossible to kinetically project power without these phenomena, so a proof of power protocol like poking or pinching doubles as a one-stop objective reality verification shop for the sapient brain. If a human can generate proof of power, then they can take comfort in knowing that the concrete phenomena of shared objective reality, energy, mass, time, space, are present and accounted for within the context of what they're experiencing, helping their mind reach a quicker conclusion about what's real. The purpose of this section is to illustrate yet another reason why physical power is useful and to demonstrate yet another application for the proof of power protocol. Not only is proof of power necessary for survival and helpful for wild animals seeking to establish dominance hierarchies, it's also essential for helping sapiens, creatures who are trapped behind their abstract thoughts, determine what is and isn't real. When we factor in sapient metacognition and the processes our brains use to cross-reference abstract thoughts with sensory inputs, we can see that proof of power doubles as proof of physical reality. Without the ability to detect the presence of physical power using protocols like poking or pinching, it's much harder for people to be confident that what they're experiencing is real or not. Trapped in an inescapable and imaginary world behind their eyes and continuously spammed by abstract thoughts produced by an overpowered, oversized and overclocked neocortex, proof of power serves as a reliable signal for the human brain to identify what is physically and objectively real in an otherwise imaginary world. Physical power is like the North Star for our brains. It helps us navigate across an ocean of imaginary thoughts to get to what's true. Without being able to manually generate a physical power signal for the purpose of cross-referencing abstract thoughts with sensory inputs, A human cannot verify if what they see and hear physically exists, or if it is just another one of a countless series of abstract beliefs produced by their hyperactive imagination. Imprisoned by our own abstract thinking, physical power is a critical lifeline. We almost desperately rely on physical power signals to know what's real. What does this have to do with Bitcoin? The bottom line up front is that cyberspace is an imaginary reality. Virtual reality is, by definition, not physical reality. Cyberspace is nothing but abstract symbolic meaning applied to the combined state space of all the state mechanisms connected to each other via internet. Operating online is akin to being in a dream state. It's a shared abstract medium through which people in physical reality communicate. But until the invention of proof-of-work protocols like Bitcoin, cyberspace was missing something: an open-source, decentralized proof-of-power protocol. People who operate online have no way to cross-reference the imaginary things they experience online with a genuine proof-of-power signal that they can use to validate if something is real or not. As will be discussed in the next chapter, Bitcoin appears to fix this by creating a proof-of-power signal to serve as proof-of-real signal. Evolution of abstract thinking. Symbolism begets symbolism. Once you're locked into this synergy, it's hard to stop it from building a whole new world. Charles Foster. Applications of abstract thinking. In comparison to the timescale of evolution, human abstract thinking became very advanced very quickly. Humans started using their massive neocortices for advanced pattern finding to enhance their hunting and gathering activities. The ability to detect and exploit patterns is very useful for learning the behavior of surrounding fauna and flora. Sapiens also benefited from the ability to produce false positive patterns because it made them exercise more caution and increased the probability of detecting true threats. Another benefit to be gained from bidirectional abstract thinking is that it allows the imagination to influence the processing of the brain's sensory inputs, leading to the phenomena called symbolism. Thanks to symbolism, humans can produce and detect meaning from otherwise objectively meaningless sensory input data. The author has just described 3 of 10 applications of abstract thinking mastered by sapiens over the past 50,000 years. 1. Advanced pattern finding. 2. Exercising caution. 3. Symbolism. A complete list of 10 applications of abstract thinking discussed in this chapter is listed in Table 1 below. Table 1. Applications of abstract thinking. Application: advanced pattern finding. Description: patching up experiential knowledge gaps about shared objective physical reality using abstract thoughts and hypotheses. Application: exercising caution. Description: producing false positive imaginary beliefs about threats to improve probability of survival. Application: symbolism. Description: assigning imaginary abstract meaning to patterns observed in shared objective reality. Application: planning and strategizing. Description: producing abstract simulations to forecast future scenarios within the safety and comfort of one's own mind. Application: semantically and syntactically complex language. Description: developing semantically and syntactically complex languages as a medium to exchange symbolically meaningful, conceptually dense, mathematically discrete and precise information. Application: storytelling. Description: leveraging abstract thinking, imagination, and high-order language to construct virtual realities to share with other humans for enhanced relationship building, knowledge sharing, entertainment, and vicarious experience. Application: solving physically unverifiable mysteries. Description: explaining phenomenon impossible to objectively know or understand via physical sensory inputs, most notably what happens after death. Application: developing abstract constructs and belief systems, constructing theological, philosophical, and ideological constructs to explain, justify, or shape sapient norms of behavior. Application: creating and wielding abstract power. Description: creating abstract power and control authority over sapiens as a non-energy intensive and non-injurious surrogate to using physical power as the basis for settling disputes. establishing control authority over resources and achieving consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of property. Application: encoding abstract power hierarchies. Description: formal codifying via spoken written language belief systems where people with imaginary or reified abstract power are organized into hierarchies. Abstract thinking application. 4. Planning and strategizing. Sapiens learned how to use their imaginations to improve their hunting capabilities by performing a special type of abstract thinking called planning. Driven by the need to develop better hunting strategies to take down far more physically powerful pack animal species with high CA and low BCRA, sapiens started using their overclocked and oversized brains to do something their prey couldn't: build hypothetical hunting simulations and test out strategies from the safety of their own minds. Using imagination, humans learned how to render highly complex scenarios about the future that were not coupled to their sensory inputs or directly linked to any concrete experiential knowledge within shared objective physical reality. They could run multiple hunting simulations which never occurred and fill them with people, animals, objects, and environmental conditions that didn't physically exist. They could down-select their best hunting strategies, test them in real-world operational environments, and use the experiential knowledge as feedback to train their mental models and make more realistic hunting simulations. Perhaps even more impressively, sapiens learned how to communicate and share these hunting simulations with their peers, creating shared abstract realities, aka virtual realities, filled with hunters and prey which don't exist anywhere except within their collective imaginations. This is the process through which sapiens mastered the primordial economic dynamics of hunting and became the world's peak predator. Thanks to their big brains, humans were able to develop strategies which enabled them to increase the BCRA of their targets by reducing their CA. Gradually, over time, humans learned that the hunter's job is not merely to kill a target, but to prep the target for the kill over time by reducing its CA. Over thousands of years of planning, strategizing, and testing imaginary hunting scenarios through real-world trial and error, humans mastered the art prepping their target for the kill by reducing their CA using tactics like increasing standoff distance or taking advantage of the topography of the local environment. For example, instead of trying to take on a powerful herd of caribou in an open field, like a pride of lions would try to take on a herd of wildebeest, humans took advantage of their advanced pattern-finding capabilities to study the migration behavior of caribou, predict what paths they would take, and find the ideal spot along that path where their CA is lowest to ambush them. A herd of caribou is quite powerful and can impose a lot of physical cost on attackers in an open field, a high CA zone. But caribou can't impose severe physical costs on attackers as effectively when they're wedged in the bottom of a canyon with spears raining down on them, a low CA zone. Thus, an effective hunting strategy for increasing the BCRA of a herd of caribou is to predict their migration patterns and find a spot where their CA is the lowest due to the topography of the environment, then simply wait for them to get there. To that end, humans can park themselves at the top of a canyon and wait for the caribou to arrive. Once they do, they can throw spears down on them from a safe standoff distance, where their capacity to impose severe physical cost on their attackers is rendered useless or ineffective. While there are many peak predators intelligent enough to employ similar hunting capabilities, no surviving animal appears to be as skilled at hunting as humans are. Hunting strategies like this require lots of abstract thinking because humans must use their imaginations to predict their prey's behaviors and intentions. This type of abstract thinking is what's known as intentionality or theory of mind, and sapiens are extraordinarily good at it. In fact, one of the most defining characteristics of behaviorally modern sapiens is that they have a remarkably high order of intentionality and theory of mind. Simply put, modern sapiens can predict and understand the thoughts and intentions of other brains remarkably well. The more thoughts and intentions one can predict, the higher order of intentionality they are said to have, but the more cognitively demanding it is to make those predictions. Fortunately, because sapiens evolved much better thought-processing hardware, they have become much better at predicting the mental states of other creatures, and therefore have much higher orders of intentionality and much higher degrees of theory of mind. Another way to think about this is that human brains are so large and powerful that they have enough spare thought-processing margin left over to dedicate towards thinking as their neighbors. Not surprisingly, this makes the hosts of sapient brains exceptionally talented at hunting, despite how weak their bodies are in comparison to the animals they frequently hunt. Sapiens have driven dozens of gigantic species to extinction, not by projecting more physical power than them, although the ability to wield fire clearly helped, but by out-thinking them. A simple way to think about the strategic advantages of high-order intentionality is that it makes sapiens way better mind readers than any other species on Earth. Because they're better mind readers, that makes sapiens better hunters. What sapiens lack in physical strength, they make up for 10 times over with intelligence, specifically their ability to predict what neighboring organisms are going to think and do long before they think and do them. Like fighting a Jedi, animals often find themselves helpless against humans, despite being far more physically powerful than humans. This is largely because humans are extremely talented at predicting what's going to happen before it happens, and placing themselves in exactly the right position they need to be in to defeat their much more physically powerful opponent. In a very short amount of time on Earth, sapiens have proven that advanced pattern finding combined with planning and strategizing using higher-order intentionality and theory of mind is an extraordinarily effective power projection tactic. Between their ability to wield fire and their ability to effectively read the minds of their prey by thinking like their prey, sapiens quickly became one of the world's most lethal predators despite being comparatively unathletic. Abstract Thinking Application 5, Semantically and Syntactically Complex Language. The great thing about bugs is that nobody gives a S if you kill them. Kenny the Talking Gun, high on life. As sapiens further honed their abstract thinking skills, they graduated from imagining highly realistic hunting simulations to imagining all sorts of other abstract realities. Their overclocked and hyperactive neocortices started to assign abstract meaning to recurring patterns in their campfires and in the stars above their heads. They started using abstract thinking not just to connect dots and fill gaps in experiential knowledge, but also to account for phenomena they can't physically verify using sensory inputs at all, most notably what happens after death. Perhaps the most disruptive application of abstract thinking to emerge after planning and strategizing was semantically and syntactically complex high-order language. High-order language enabled humans to share their individually imagined abstract realities together much more easily. This allowed them to synchronize their imaginary thoughts together well enough to create large-scale shared abstract realities. Before discussing high-order language, it's important for the reader to note that sapiens were well equipped with rudimentary forms of language long before they learned how to use symbols to produce semantically and syntactically complex language. Humans communicate the same way many other mammals do in ways that far predate words and grammar, and to many people's surprise, these instinctive communication protocols foster far deeper connections and bonding. Humans groom each other, dance, laugh, sing, and howl with each other. They also adjust their size and posture, make gestures with their appendages, beat their chests, stomp their feet, squint their faces, and use many other communication techniques that other mammals use. It is not uncommon to see animals of different classes, for example mammals and birds, communicate friendship or bonding exactly the same way via cuddling or grooming, or with very similar body language. This is why humans communicate their trust and affection for each other and for their pets, by cuddling or petting them. This is simply a common language between many species, especially mammals. On the opposite side of the communication spectrum is how animals signal pain, sadness, and suffering the same way. This topic is uncomfortable but relevant to discussions about human-on-human killing and why humans adopt systems to try to avoid killing. Mammals, for example, narrow their eyes and grimace the same, wince the same, and scream and whimper the same. Some biologists have argued that this is why humans often struggle to kill other mammals, which are equipped with eyelids and vocal cords used to communicate pain and suffering the same way. Yet the same human who would never want to hurt a mammal will have no problem impaling, disemboweling, crushing, burning, electrocuting, or boiling fish, shellfish, or insects alive. The reason why this happens is because these different classes of animals have different instinctive communication protocols, and therefore don't communicate pain, sadness, and suffering the same way. If fish had eyelids or contortable muscles in their faces to communicate pain the same way mammals do, the experience of fishing would probably be much different for sapiens than it is today. This same phenomenon is believed to be the reason why domesticated wolves, aka dogs, evolved special muscles around their eyes to make sad expressions which appeal to their human masters. So-called puppy dog eyes are argued to be an evolutionary tactic which helps dogs communicate to humans, particularly their sadness, pain, suffering, and desires, in ways that humans intuitively understand. Some have argued that the cuteness of puppy eyes is a defense mechanism against the cruelty of their masters, and one of several reasons why the sad and pitiful-looking dogs, expressions that humans might condescendingly call adorable, have survived as human pets. Both anthropologists and biologists have theorized that the double standard in predatory human behavior is the result of two different classes of species evolving two different communication techniques. And unfortunately for fish and insects, humans are incapable of detecting that fish and insects are in pain or they're suffering. The study of fish and insect neurons have shown they are capable of nociception, detection of pain, and that they react the same way mammals do when they encounter extreme heat, cold, or other harmful stimuli. But these organisms lack the eyelids, vocal cords, and other musculature needed to grimace and howl to communicate their pain and suffering the same way most mammals do, so humans are naturally less reserved about harming them than they are about harming mammals, which communicate pain and suffering the same way humans do. This small change in how different classes of animal evolve to communicate differently leads to dramatically different emergent behavior. This uncomfortable discussion about human predation is relevant because it explains why humans go to such great lengths to avoid the discomfort of killing and injuring other mammals, or why they are quick to outsource these activities to other people. The author has direct experience with this as both an active duty service member as well as the heir to a beef cattle farm. One popular anthropological theory posits that humans are highly capable of sensing that they're causing pain or suffering to the mammals they domesticate and slaughter, so they utilize their abstract thinking skills to develop imaginary justifications for their predation to reconcile the emotional discomfort. Some theorize that this need for emotional reconciliation was a leading contributing factor to the rapid adoption and sudden popularity of theistic religions following the domestication of animals. The theory posits that humans adopted abstract belief systems where they perceive themselves or other humanoid gods in their image to be the rulers of nature because it gave agrarian society a way to emotionally reconcile the guilt of being so predatory. It should be noted that predatory guilt is a unique trait of human predators. Other apex predators do not appear to feel guilty about their predatory behavior like humans do, possibly because they do not have the physiological capacity, that is, the brain power. The desire not to cause pain and suffering to other animals, particularly the animals which express their pain with eyelids the same way humans do, explains why humans adopted abstract belief systems where sapient pecking order is determined by people who have imaginary power over other people. Sapiens simply don't want to see each other experience pain and suffering while establishing their dominance hierarchies using physical power. Imaginary power hierarchies, aka polities like governments, give people an alternative to using physical power to settle their intraspecies disputes and establish their intraspecies pecking order. The reasoning is because non-physical methods for establishing pecking order don't directly cause injury the same way physical power does, so they can't cause as much detectable pain and suffering. As a side note, it's worth noting that this reasoning ignores systemic factors contributing to warfare and is based upon the assumption that human pain and suffering are strictly the byproduct of a linear chain of events where the last event preceding the pain, for example being shot or stabbed, is the primary root cause of all human pain and suffering. As will be discussed in later chapters, this reasoning is flawed because it ignores important systemic factors, which could also contribute substantially to human pain and suffering, like dysfunctional belief systems which motivate physical conflict. In other words, these theories ignore why people become compelled to stab and shoot each other in the first place, despite their natural instincts to avoid causing injury and suffering to their fellow species. Assuming these theories are valid, then another way to say the same thing is that one reason why belief systems like humanoid-centric religions and governments first emerged and became so popular is not just to explain the unexplainable, but also because of guilt. Humans feel guilty for causing pain to the animals they prey upon, unless those animals don't have eyelids and vocal cords like bugs and fish. So they adopt imaginary belief systems to either justify their predatory behavior or find ways around it to establish their pecking order. Oftentimes, the explicit goal of these imaginary belief systems is stated to be to avoid having to use physical power to settle disputes and establish a dominance hierarchy. Unfortunately, these belief systems frequently become dysfunctional, leading to humans killing each other despite their guilt or their desire to avoid it. In addition to being able to communicate happiness or suffering using common languages between mammals, sapiens also have a base-layer common language specific to the species. For example, all sapiens smile, laugh, and sing exactly the same way regardless of where they are born. Human children born deaf and blind, who have never seen or heard other people smile or laugh, will smile and laugh the exact same way other humans do. Sapiens also instinctively communicate with others who have immature or underdeveloped brains the same way, using a sing-song pattern of wider spectrum and varying pitch known as infant-directed speech or baby talk. This is why humans baby talk to their babies, pets, elderly or mentally handicapped people, regardless of their culture. Humans instinctively recognize they're having underdeveloped brains and have a common base-layer communication protocol for it. This also explains why people feel comforted when they hear other people baby talk. It's an instinctive communication protocol that connects humans on a far deeper level than modern spoken and written languages. These communication techniques are purely instinctive. They're natural patterns of behavior passed on to us via our genetics. This means sapiens actually communicate the same way, and more meaningfully, regardless of what higher-order semantic languages they use. By singing, dancing, laughing, grooming, and baby-talking with each other, it is possible to form deep, emotionally satisfying connections with strangers or people who can't speak or write the same higher-order language, hence the romantic stories about strangers from different worlds who speak different languages but still find deep emotional connections with each other. For these reasons, it's not uncommon for people to be more emotionally attached and affectionate with their pets than with their friends and extended family members. The loss of a pet can be as emotionally traumatic as the loss of a family member because animals, mammals especially, bond the same way sapiens do without the need for semantics, syntactics, and higher-order language. The point is, spoken and written language is not as important for human-on-human communication and bonding as people think it is. Humans communicate the majority of their feelings using body language and in other unconscious techniques, and then rely on semantically and syntactically complex spoken or written languages to fill in the smaller, finer details of rational information. The main takeaway of this detailed exploration of communication is to illustrate that the primary value-delivered function of higher-order spoken and written language is not to emotionally connect with each other, because there are far more effective ways to do that than by using semantically and syntactically complex language. Instead, the primary value-delivered function of higher-order semantically and syntactically complex spoken and written languages appears to be to encode the deeper and more instinctive level of emotion and intuition sapiens use to facilitate connection and bonding. Higher-order language is optimized for the transfer of facts and more precise descriptions of what people think and feel. This lets people synchronize their thoughts more precisely. Using spoken or written language, sapiens can effectively peer into the mind of other sapiens with much more precision and detail than other species and fill other people's minds with their own precise thoughts. Large neocortices, it turns out, are perfect vessels for the transfer of precise ideas. Large neocortices allow sapiens to construct higher-order languages by transmitting, receiving, and processing complex audible and visual patterns and converting them into abstract thoughts rich with symbolic meaning. Once sapient brains became accustomed to performing symbolism, something which probably occurred by accident and then succeeded via natural selection, as with most things in nature, people quickly developed a habit of assigning symbolic meaning to commonly detected audible and visual patterns to create morphemes, the smallest meaningful lexical items used in higher-order language. Over time, this process of assigning symbolic meaning to otherwise meaningless audible and visual patterns became increasingly more complex, until the nature of the meaning assigned to various lexical items could be changed based off their composition in a process we now call semantics. Eventually, humans learned to combine various symbols with different semantic meaning into discrete units of discourse called words, then combine them into mathematically formal and discrete structures like phrases, sentences, and grammar in a process we now call syntactics. Most high-order spoken or written languages, including and especially the languages we use to program computers, are composed of these same two components. Shapes and sounds are imbued with abstract and symbolic meaning, semantics, and then combined into some type of mathematically discrete and formal structure, syntactics, giving rise to complex language that we can use to convey both highly abstract and highly precise thoughts. This type of communication is not necessary for survival or forming bonds because humans spent most of their existence without it, but higher-order language is extremely useful as a medium of exchange for conceptually dense and mathematically discrete information through which people can use to share abstract and precise thoughts with each other. As will be discussed in the following chapter, the pinnacle of humans using symbolism to assign semantic and syntactically complex meaning to things in order to connect neocortices together is machine code. Using symbolic reasoning and language techniques like Boolean logic, sapiens can turn practically any physical state-changing phenomenon into information that can be stored or transferred to other people or machines. The crown jewel of higher-order semantically and syntactically complex language is machine code, the ability to communicate with and through machines. This remarkable application of abstract thinking is what makes the Internet work. The Internet is just people communicating to other people through physical, state-changing mechanisms using Boolean logic. A clear limitation of higher-order language is that it only works for people who have taken the time to memorize the semantic meaning and syntactic structure of the language protocol, whereas it takes no effort to learn how to communicate with strangers using singing, laughing, and baby talk. Higher-order language takes years, even decades, to learn. Sapiens can and often go their entire lives with nothing more than a shallow appreciation of the semantic and syntactic depth of the language protocols they learn. This is perhaps because higher-order language is merely a means to an end, not an end in and of itself. Most sapiens don't learn higher-order language for the sake of knowing the semantic and syntactic details of a higher-order language. They learn it for the sake of peering into the minds of other sapiens and connecting abstract realities together through a process called storytelling. Abstract thinking application. 6. Storytelling. The pen is mightier than the sword. Edward Bulwer Lytton. By assigning symbolic meaning to random shapes and sounds, then using syntactics to assemble them together into a common topological or audible structure, Humans can exchange information with high levels of precision to communicate their abstract ideas. This capability allows sapiens to do something remarkable, connect their imaginations together to form a single, shared, abstract reality. Consider how people create and develop common belief systems. Thanks to the invention of higher-order languages, two or more neocortices with no physical or neural connection can share the exact same symbolic experiences and knowledge, allowing them to think the same things, detect the same patterns, and even interpret the same meaning from mutually exclusive physical sensory inputs. Two brains can't share the same physical sensory input, but they can interpret different sensory inputs the same way. Through higher-order language, sapiens build shared abstract scenarios within their minds and fill them with emotionally complex and interesting people with multiple layers of mental states, perceptions, beliefs, desires, high-order intentionality, and high degree of theory of mind. Non-physically existent people can be put into places which don't exist, surrounded by creatures and objects which aren't real. Moreover, their actions, motivations, and thought processes can be imbued with conceptually dense, symbolic meaning. From the safety and comfort of their minds, sapiens who know the same higher-order language can experience and explore their imaginary worlds together. They can teach each other useful lessons, explain unsolved mysteries, offer profound insights, and steer sapient brains through quests, crucibles, and puzzles which allow their hosts to experience the full spectrum of emotion. Using a written form of higher-order language, neocortices can connect together in this way not just across thousands of miles of space, but also across thousands of years of time, communicating asynchronously over timescales which far exceed their hosts' lifespans. Through written language, humans can even share the same abstract experiences with other humans who lived thousands of years before them. The author defines this extraordinary capability as storytelling. For the same reason that sapient brains are extremely gifted at planning and hunting, they're also extremely gifted at storytelling. There is a clear cognitive link between storytelling and hunting. Both activities rely on precisely the same set of cognitive tools, that is high-order intentionality and theory of mind, with only minor differences in their application. This becomes an extremely important concept to note for future discussions about hunting people through their belief systems by nefarious storytelling. There are solid technical and metacognitive grounds for sapiens to have an instinctive fear of, or distrust in, or attraction to good rhetoricians, for example, politicians, religious leaders. To put it simply, peak storytellers are peak predators. They deserve caution. It has been hypothesized that sapiens' unique ability to think abstractly, form symbols, develop higher-order languages, and connect brains via storytelling is what enabled them to start cooperating at far higher scales than other packs of primates. A famous anthropological theory by Robin Dunbar states there is a cognitive limit to how many physical features, that is patterns, a human brain can memorize. This would imply there's a cognitive limit to how many different faces a single brain can recognize and trust enough to cooperate with. This notional limit, often called Dunbar's number, is estimated to be approximately 150 people. Dunbar's theory offers a viable explanation for why human tribes did not exceed this number for many hundreds of thousands of years prior to the emergence of abstract thought. Despite their big brains and all their excess thinking power, humans simply didn't have the memory to form meaningful relationships with more than 150 people, so they weren't inclined to cooperate at higher scales. Like the single-celled organisms discussed in the previous chapter, the inability to cooperate at higher scales inhibits humans' ability to grow their CA and results in a bounded prosperity trap. Despite their ability to control fire, small nomadic tribes of humans had relatively little advantage. They were not nearly as high on the food chain as modern humans are today. Sapiens were the only species of human to escape the bounded prosperity trap caused by Dunbar's number-induced cooperation limits, and it appears they did it in part by combining abstract thinking, theoretical planning, symbolism, higher-order language and storytelling together to create shared abstract realities and belief systems which enabled them to trust each other and cooperate at scales which far exceed the physical constraints causing Dunbar's number. Another way to think about storytelling is that it allows sapiens to mentally groom and bond with each other via stories, rather than having to physically groom each other or even spend any time with each other. Hence the deep emotional attachments people form with movie celebrities or other types of story characters. Mutually shared beliefs or stories enable sapiens to transcend the physical constraints of regular grooming to form trusting and cooperative relationships at much larger scale. For example, a single primate is capable of physically grooming one, maybe two other primates at the same time to earn their trust and cooperation. Meanwhile, sapiens can capture the attention and influence the behavior of thousands of other sapiens simultaneously, using nothing more than a story to earn their attention, trust, and willingness to cooperate. That same storyteller can get those 1,000 people to trust and cooperate with each other by virtue of the fact that they now share the same abstract reality or belief system. Sapiens are unique in comparison to other wild animals because they cooperate together simply because they believe in the same thing, not because they share the same physical experiences. This subtle but extraordinary difference makes sapiens much more capable of mass cooperation at scale. Why? For the simple reason that the ability to believe in the same thing is not constrained by physics, whereas the ability to share the same physically objective experiences together is highly constrained by physics. Storytelling can therefore be thought of as the glue which holds modern societies together. Without that glue, sapiens are both physically and physiologically incapable of cooperating together at levels exceeding small tribes. We literally don't have the time, energy, or memory capacity for it. This means a primary value-delivered function of storytelling is to overcome the constraints of shared objective physical reality. We use our spoken and written stories to bypass the constraints of physics as well as the constraints of our own bodies to communicate with each other, inspire each other, cooperate with each other, and achieve things we would otherwise be both physically and psychologically incapable of achieving. If we didn't adopt common symbols, languages, stories, and belief systems, and instead relied exclusively on experiential knowledge and memory to cooperate with each other, we would need to have massive budgets of time and memory to develop the experiential knowledge needed to create connections and commit them to memory. We would need comedically large brains, very large appetites, and very long lifespans to achieve a fraction of the cooperation we can achieve by simply using stories. Storytelling functions as a life hack that sapiens unlocked by learning abstract thinking. Thanks to stories, people don't have to rely on interactions with other people to cooperate at scales that are up to 40 million times larger than Dunbar's number. They just need to hear the same stories and adopt the same belief systems. This explains why symbolism is extraordinarily effective at promoting higher levels of cooperation. It gets people to think the same way, believe the same things, and most importantly, signal to each other that they have the same belief systems to facilitate higher-order cooperation and trust. Humans can use their storytelling abilities to build shared abstract realities which offer satisfying explanations for phenomena observed in shared objective reality. They can imbue objective physical phenomenon with abstract meaning to make mutual experiences feel more profound and enjoyable. Then, armed with the symbolic meaning of the stories they tell, sapiens can cooperate at scales which far exceed their own physical and physiological capacity. In other words, storytelling is an abstract superpower, hence why Edward Bulwer-Lytton observed that the pen is mightier than the sword. A more technically accurate way to say the same phrase would be higher-order syntactically and semantically complex written language can influence, organize, and direct more unified physical power than a single person swinging a sword can. People can achieve things far beyond their physical limits using the right combination of stories. By simply believing in the same thing, Regardless of whether that thing is real or imaginary, sapiens can sum their power together to achieve extraordinary things like assembling the International Space Station. Rooted at the center of all this achievement is something which doesn't even necessarily have to exist. The stories sapiens tell each other to cooperate as massive scale can be, and probably are, fictional. All that matters is that people believe in them. As long as people can stick together by believing in the same imaginary things, they can build the Great Pyramids of Giza. They can literally move mountains. Storytelling is how money and currencies work. Money is nothing more than a belief system, one of many completely fictional stories told by storytellers that people voluntarily choose to believe in. By believing in the same money, that is medium for transferring financial information, people can and will cooperate with each other at scales which far exceed their physical and physiological limits. On the flip side, when money breaks down, cooperation breaks down. If people stop believing in the same money, cooperation comes crashing down. A collapsing money is a collapsing society. It has ended several empires. Because money is a belief system, the manipulation of money, such as when manipulating the supply of money, is technically a form of passive-aggressive psychological abuse. People who distort the medium for transferring financial information are systemic predators who prey on people's belief system, eroding their ability to cooperate with each other and contributing to the collapse of society. The most successful monies have been those which physically constrain this type of systemic exploitation, for example, gold. Adding all these concepts together, we get a comprehensive understanding for why symbols and stories are extremely important to the prosperity of sapiens. Symbols and stories breed common belief systems, and common belief systems have unrivaled success in the animal kingdom at achieving cooperation. By believing in the same stories told by storytellers, humans can cooperate at extraordinary scales which dwarf other species. They can use that power to build pyramids or to impose severe, physically prohibitive costs on attackers. This means cooperation is fundamentally a dual-use power projection tactic evolved by nature, a way to increase BA, increase CA, and adjust BCRA. To project more physical power, simply sum it together by telling more compelling stories which motivate people to cooperate at a higher scale by adopting the same belief system. With the right combination of stories, humans can do things they would never otherwise be capable of doing. They can end old empires and build new ones simply by changing their minds. A good storyteller can facilitate sapient cooperation at scales which far exceed Dunbar's number because they don't require people to physically experience the same thing. They just require people to hear and believe the same story. Add to this phenomenon the fact that sapiens are extremely intelligent hunters who can control fire and tap into what is effectively an infinite supply of exogenous power from the surrounding environment. And it's easy to see why the stories told by sapiens, not the sapiens themselves nor the technologies they wield, are extremely effective and asymmetrically valuable power projection tactics. Symbols and storytelling should never be underestimated. Civilizations rise and fall because of symbols, stories, and belief systems, things which don't exist anywhere except within people's imaginations. The socio-technical implications of storytelling are simple but profound. Sapiens did not physiologically change after arriving at behavioral modernity to become more capable of memorizing faces. We are equally as cognitively constrained as our ancestors were during the Upper Paleolithic era. In fact, we are probably more constrained. Human brains started to shrink after they started domesticating themselves. The ability for sapiens to cooperate and function on scales up to nation-state level is therefore derived predominantly from something abstract, which resides exclusively within their imagination. That means things like national strategic security are heavily derived from stories more than probably anything else. To harness more physical power to increase CA and lower BCRA, tell persuasive stories. To capture more resources or be a good conqueror, be a good storyteller, and hunt humans through their belief systems. Here we begin to see the downside of storytelling. What humans gain in their ability to cooperate with each other, they lose in systemic security. A major downside to storytelling is that it makes it possible to hunt humans psychologically rather than physically. Recall from the previous section that a hunter's job is to decrease their target's CA and increase their BCRA. Storytelling enables people to do this to other people, often without attributability, that is, no blood trail. With the right stories, people will forfeit their physical power or lay down their arms. Sapiens can be domesticated by the stories they believe, and like lambs, they will walk straight into slaughter. It's also possible to feed stories to human populations which divide them and make them less likely to cooperate. They can be convinced via theology, philosophy, and ideology to forfeit their physical strength for something which only exists in their collective imagination. The bottom line is that the prosperity and survival of the sapient species depends upon the stories they choose to believe in. All of our combined achievements are irrevocably linked to our stories and combined belief systems. What a population chooses to believe has very real, very meaningful consequences on their ability to survive and prosper, so it is extraordinarily important for them to pick the right stories and belief systems. Abstract thinking application. 7. Solving physically unverifiable mysteries. Another useful application of storytelling is creating explanations for phenomena that are physically impossible to verify via physical sensory inputs or experiential knowledge. The most common example of this is explaining what happens to sapiens after death. Upper Paleolithic sapiens came to believe in the same afterlife because of storytelling. The primary storytellers of this time were shamans who convinced their tribes the afterlife was a desirable place to be. Over countless years and countless campfires, shamans expanded on their stories, specifying details about gateways to the afterlife. They added more details about how they can access the gateway to the afterlife and even communicate with deceased ancestors on the other side. Here, the first signs of abstract power began to emerge. An easy way to tell if human fossils are from a time after the emergence of abstract thinking and storytelling is to look for signs of a belief in the afterlife. Most animals show nothing more than casual interest in the bodies of their dead, but storytelling humans who lived within the past 50,000 years demonstrate substantial interest in the bodies of their dead. Signs of belief in the afterlife appear in the human fossil record at approximately the same time as other early signs of abstract thinking and self-consciousness. Belief in the afterlife is therefore one of the oldest known human belief systems. Preparation for the afterlife is noteworthy because it demonstrates an understanding of oneself in relation to time, as well as indicates a time preference for future self over current self. Sapiens not only started to make a conscious distinction between themselves and others within their environment, but they also started to make a conscious distinction between their current selves and future selves, particularly with respect to living self and unliving self. Behaviorally modern Paleolithic sapiens started making careful preparations for their future selves via ceremonies like burying rituals. They indicated their time preference for the future by virtue of their sacrifices in the present. The dead would be buried with valuable resources the tribe needs for survival, a self-sacrificial practice which makes no rational sense except for those who believe in and have a higher preference for an imaginary future self living in a place after death. Through Paleolithic burial practices, we can see a signature characteristic of behavioral modernity, making meaningful sacrifices for something completely imaginary, their future self. Abstract thinking application. 8. Developing abstract constructs and belief systems. Upper Paleolithic shaman storytellers could answer questions about the afterlife which other members of the tribe couldn't even think to ask. These shamans could ostensibly communicate to tribal ancestors years after their ancestors' death, giving the shamans very high social value. Shamans could also imbue tribal activities with symbolic meaning, making tribal activities seem more blessed and profound. Shamans who were particularly skilled at storytelling could persuade their peers to believe that a person's hunting and gathering actions represented much more than just the act of physically capturing resources. It represented something important, or something even more novel at the time, something ideologically good. The emergence of the concept of good also meant sapiens could start engaging in activities that would qualify as being ideologically bad, giving rise to the development of abstract constructs we now call ethics and morals. As much as sapiens' hubris often compels them to believe otherwise, there may not be anything objectively good or bad about anything we experience in shared objective physical reality. Our brains might just be applying symbolic meaning to objectively meaningless things like we already know they can do so effortlessly well. But if, for the sake of argument, we assume there is such a thing as objective good, then there's nothing to say that sapiens are special creatures in the universe who are somehow uniquely qualified to define what good means. Interstellar travelers who visited Earth could have much different opinions about good than we do, a very common plotline in modern films. One possible explanation for why humans subscribe to moral, ethical, theological, and ideological belief systems is to provide abstract explanations for their natural instincts. As discussed previously, sapiens have an incredible capacity for using their imagination to detect patterns which don't necessarily exist and come up with viable explanations for unsolvable mysteries. Well, natural instincts have clear patterns and are quite mysterious. It makes sense that humans would try to use abstract thinking to produce satisfying explanations for why they repeatedly feel compelled to behave in certain ways. Ethics and morals provide such logical and satisfying abstract explanations. For example, it's common for people to believe that the reason why sapiens don't like the idea of killing other sapiens is because killing people is bad. But at the same time, it is also logical to believe that killing people is immoral is an abstract explanation for what could just as easily be described and empirically examined as a very common natural instinct in multiple species across multiple different animal classes, which developed over hundreds of millions of years of natural selection for obvious existential reasons. If humans had no disinclination to kill each other over food and territory disputes, they would be less capable of cooperation and thus far less likely to survive and prosper in the wild against mutual threats. So, killing people is immoral could just as easily be described as people who aren't instinctively disinclined to kill their peers didn't survive and prosper and pass on their genes as much as people who are instinctively disinclined to kill their peers. Morals and ethics can be used in the opposite direction too. In addition to offering satisfying explanations about natural instincts, abstract thinking can also be used to offer satisfying justifications for behavior which goes against our natural instincts. As discussed previously, animals within the same class often communicate the same way, particularly their pain and suffering. Many sapiens instinctively feel discomfort injuring other mammals or seeing them suffer, because most mammals communicate their pain and suffering precisely the same way humans do, for example, squinting eyelids, contorted facial features, and screams. As previously mentioned, sapiens are far less uncomfortable killing and injuring non-mammalian species who are equally as capable of nociception, feeling pain, like bugs, fish, and shellfish. Sapiens regularly impale, disembowel, and boil these animals alive with little to no reservation. All because fish, bugs, and shellfish don't have eyelids, contorted facial muscles, or vocal cords to communicate their pain and suffering the same way mammals do. To repeat a previous point, anthropologists have argued that theology became popular in the Neolithic age out of psychological necessity. The argument is that sapiens started believing in humanoid gods to alleviate their cognitive dissonance and emotionally reconcile the mass exploitation and abuse of the mammals they were domesticating, the incontrovertible foundation of modern agrarian society. Irrigating large amounts of rain-watered land requires the entrapment and enslavement of aurochs to create plow-pulling pack animals like oxen. Feeding densely populated areas like cities required massive-scale entrapment, enslavement, and slaughter of animals like boars, jungle fowl, and aurochs to produce the bacon we eat for breakfast, the chicken we eat for lunch, and the beef we eat for dinner. In other words, running agrarian society involves a lot of mammals squinting their eyes, tensing their faces, and screaming as they are continuously bred by humans to be imprisoned, corralled, whipped, and slaughtered at massive scale. Today, we entrap and slaughter animals by the billions. The author does not intend to sound self-righteous or judgmental. My family owns a beef cattle farm. The goal is to practice being technically valid, intellectually honest, and as amoral as possible when evaluating power projection tactics in agrarian society. It's hard to dedicate one's life to the agrarian lifestyle without being tempted by abstract belief systems which claim that sapiens are above other animals, or that somehow their pain and suffering isn't as bad as we think it is because they are less intelligent than we are. Once people have adopted the characteristically Neolithic belief that sapiens have transcended nature and animals exist to serve them, it's not a major leap of cultural evolution to believe that gods exist, or that these gods have a distinctively humanoid shape. An easy way to justify our domestication of animals is by believing that we are the gods. This line of thinking would explain why signs of theological beliefs in the human fossil record explode after signs of agriculture emerge. As Foster notes, artwork changes from humans living amongst animals, running alongside packs of free-roaming caribou to cracking whips over the backs of their entrapped, genetically deformed, docile servants. Scenes change from sapiens living within nature to humans living above nature. Humanoid shapes start sitting on thrones physically isolated from the wild and looking down upon it. By the time written language emerged, sapiens had thousands of years of experience believing in gods and looking down on nature. This alone explains why the basis of many moral, ethical, and theological philosophies look down on nature too and encourage humans not to behave like wild animals. The implicit assumption of these assertions is that the behavior of wild animals is somehow bad. The lion who kills the pack's cubs to keep the bloodline pure, or the squirrel who eats her babies to avoid starvation, is perceived as bad behavior. The act of being physically aggressive or using physical power to settle disputes, manage resources, and establish dominance hierarchies like wild animals do is asserted to be bad or animalistic, even though sapiens have never stopped behaving this way, hence war. The point of this section is to illustrate that theology, philosophy, and ideology are abstract and subjective constructs which emerged from sapient abstract thought. Many ideologies make bold assertions which imply humans know better than nature, that we are somehow uniquely qualified to know what right is. But an intellectually honest person should recognize that it may not be objectively true that sapiens have miraculously discovered a metaphysically transcendent, ontologically superior, or causally efficacious capacity for good and bad. It could be that sapiens have oversized, overpowered, and hyperactive neocortices optimized for abstract thinking, combined with a lot of spare time on their hands. Sapiens clearly have a strong desire to produce explanations for natural instincts, as well as to alleviate the cognitive dissonance of acting against their instincts to reconcile and justify the massive-scale predation and systemic exploitation of the natural environment we now call modern agrarian civilized society. But the idea of good and bad doesn't appear to have existed anywhere except within the imagination of humans. There is little indication that other living creatures, particularly the ones with small neocortices, can detect them. But even if we assumed other animals can believe in moral good, it's not safe to assume they would have the same beliefs about the morality of sapiens as sapiens have about themselves. Even if we take the position that humans are special, unique, and favored within the universe, sapiens still have nothing to quantify one combination of time, space, mass, and energy as more or less good than another combination of time, space, mass, and energy. Theological, philosophical, and ideological constructs are demonstrably subjective. Different societies have had very different moral and ethical beliefs, probably because they grow up listening to different stories told by different storytellers. We can't even agree between ourselves what moral means. Sapiens commonly use physical power to settle their disputes about what good or God means, or who has the right to define right. This brings us to a uniquely human power projection tactic: creating abstract, imaginary sources of power. Understanding abstract power. Those who tell the stories rule society. Plato. So far, the author has outlined 8 of 10 applications of abstract thinking which behaviorally modern sapiens have evolved since the Upper Paleolithic era. The reader has learned about how sapient neocortices help sapiens with pattern finding, exercising caution, symbolism, planning, strategizing, higher-order communication using semantically and syntactically complex languages, storytelling, solving physically unverifiable mysteries, and developing abstract constructs and belief systems like morals, ethics, and theologies. The last 2 applications of abstract thought are so important to the topic of power projection tactics employed by humans in modern agrarian society that they each get their own dedicated section. 9. Creating abstract power, and 10. Encoding abstract power hierarchies. As a quick disclaimer for the reader, these sections represent an inflection point where the concepts become political sounding. This is due to the subject matter, a discussion about how abstract power is created, how abstract power hierarchies function, and how abstract power hierarchies become dysfunctional to the point of motivating people to fight and kill each other at larger scales is fundamentally a discussion about politics. Additionally, discussions about why humans fight and kill each other is an emotionally charged topic. There are few things as personal or as emotionally charged than the motives behind why one person would feel inclined to take the life of another. To avoid physical conflict, sapiens use abstract thinking to play make-believe. Sapient brains are so effortlessly gifted at abstract thinking, and people have such strong natural instincts not to injure each other, that people will attempt to use their imaginations to avoid having to physically confront each other to settle their disputes, manage their resources, and establish their dominance hierarchies. One of the most defining characteristics of behaviorally modern sapiens who lived after the invention of agriculture and the wide-scale domestication of animals is the adoption of common belief systems where some people are able to wield abstract or imaginary power, and those people are allowed to settle disputes, manage resources, and determine the pecking order for the broader population. Modern domesticated sapiens could be described as being so averse to physical confrontation that they prefer to dress up in costumes and play make-believe to settle their disputes, manage their resources, and establish their pecking order. Then, emboldened by their ideologies, they look down upon wild animals precisely because those animals don't, or more accurately can't, use their imaginations to settle their disputes or establish their pecking order. As previously noted, wild animals appear to be physiologically incapable of this. They don't have the wits to think abstractly and use their imaginations because they didn't learn how to handle tinder, control fire, and cook their food to fuel their brains like humans did. Without critically examining human metacognition, it's hard to develop a first principles understanding of how and why agrarian society has decided to adopt belief systems where fully grown adults put on wigs and gowns and live-action role-play, LARP, like they have real power. Almost everywhere one looks in modern agrarian society, sapiens are seen using symbols of power rather than physical power. They print the symbols of their abstract power on pieces of cloth and tie them on top of flagpoles. They wear symbols of their abstract power as lapel pins. Some still continue to dress up in wigs, gowns, and crowns, and practically all of them stand up in front of podiums etched with symbols of their imaginary power. Everywhere one looks are ostensibly powerful people projecting symbols of power instead of real, physical power, aka watts. Why do behaviorally modern humans behave this way? In what some might consider to be a comedic display of irony, society's symbols of abstract power frequently show images of wild predators like lions, animals which became fierce precisely because they don't role-play to settle their disputes and establish their pecking order. Tying this observation back to the core concepts presented in the previous chapter about power projection tactics in nature, one of the reasons why lions are so fierce is because they mastered real power projection to build their dominance hierarchy, in addition to doing other fierce things which domesticated sapiens claim is ideologically beneath them, even though they still engage in physical power competitions on a near-routine basis. If one were to take the perspective of a non-human outsider, such as an alien visiting Earth, the social behavior of modern domesticated agrarian sapiens might seem bizarre compared to the behavior of other animals. Sapiens behave much differently than other species in nature. They live under a mutually adopted global-scale consensual hallucination where very few people get to have extraordinary levels of imaginary power that most of the population doesn't get to have access to, and then the population chooses to allow these people with non-existent physical power call the shots. Why would sapiens behave like this? The previously mentioned explanation is because it serves as an alternative way to settle disputes, establish control authority over resources, and achieve consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of property in an energy-efficient way that doesn't directly cause injury, emphasis on the word directly. In other words, abstract power is a story that people are intrinsically motivated to believe in because they like the idea of not having to spend energy or hurt each other to settle intraspecies disputes or establish their pecking order over limited resources. Abstract power and their corresponding dominance hierarchies, what the author calls abstract power hierarchies, represent a belief system to which many people subscribe simply because they want to believe that there are viable alternatives to physical conflict as the basis for settling intraspecies disputes and establishing intraspecies pecking order. It's a good story which motivates people to work together and cooperate at large scales. The idea that sapiens have somehow outsmarted natural selection and used their neocortices to find a viable substitute for physical confrontation to settle intraspecies disputes and establish interspecies pecking order is an extremely attractive idea, and as we know from the concepts provided about storytelling, the more sapiens can get behind a common idea, the more they can sum their physical power together and literally move mountains. Unfortunately, abstract belief systems are fictional stories. Our beliefs about a better way to settle our intraspecies disputes and establish our intraspecies pecking order also clearly don't work as well as we wish they would work, because sapiens still routinely engage in physical confrontation to settle intraspecies disputes and establish intraspecies pecking order the exact same way animals do. Belief in imaginary power is an attack vector which breeds god-kings. It is not the lash they fear, it is my divine power. But I am a generous god. I can make you rich beyond all measure. Xerxes, 300. There are major downsides to the wide-scale adoption of common abstract belief systems, which are critical to investigate if we are to understand why sapiens struggle to find lasting alternatives to physical confrontation as the basis for solving intraspecies disputes and establishing intraspecies pecking order. A major problem which will be discussed at length in this chapter is that belief systems represent a breeding ground for systemic predators to psychologically abuse and systemically exploit entire populations of people through their belief systems. These attacks are passive-aggressive and often go without detection because they don't have a physical footprint. It is therefore necessary to call them out explicitly so that we can better understand the complex, trans-scientific, and socio-technical implications of new technologies like Bitcoin. Storytelling introduces a psychological attack vector where sapiens can be preyed upon. The most common way this happens in agrarian society is by telling stories to convince people to adopt belief systems where a select few people have abstract power. Abstract power is systemically exploitable. By convincing people to believe in abstract power, storytellers deliberately implant an exploitable vulnerability into people's imaginations, which they can take advantage of later. It's essentially a 0 day for people who are familiar with common computer exploits. Once storytellers have convinced a population to adopt a belief system where imaginary power exists, storytellers create a vector through which they can exploit people by giving themselves access to the imaginary power endogenous to the belief system. This type of predatory behavior through people's belief systems emerged early in agrarian society and has persisted for thousands of years. A simple example of these kinds of predators who systemically exploited their population's belief systems were god kings such as a pharaoh. To better understand how vulnerable sapient belief systems are to psychological exploitation and abuse, we can use adversarial thinking to analyze how to create and codify abstract power. The reader is invited to assume you are a systemic predator who wants to psychologically exploit a human population's belief system for your own personal advantage. What is the most important thing you need the population to believe in so that you can have extraordinary amounts of imaginary power and control authority over their valuable resources? One thing that you could do is convince them to believe that using physical power to establish their dominance hierarchy is morally bad. You could convince them there are ideological alternatives to physical power for establishing control authority over their resources and achieving consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of their property. Perhaps the population might become concerned that you could abuse your abstract power to exploit them. If that's the case, then you could convince them that imaginary logical constraints encoded into rules of law are fully sufficient at protecting them against systemic predators like you who can exploit imaginary power. Once the population has been convinced that imaginary power hierarchies encoded into rules of law are incontrovertibly better solutions than physical power, then you could simply place yourself at the top of that abstract power hierarchy by masquerading as the morally, ethically, ideologically, or theologically fit candidate for the job. If you are successful, the population will bend to your will and do your bidding for you, labor for you, kill for you, give you their most valuable resources and worship you like a god, just like a domesticated animal would. In other words, you can domesticate a human population by getting them to adopt a belief system which convinces them that it's bad to be physically powerful or physically aggressive. Once they have adopted ideologies which cause them to forfeit their real power for your imaginary power, you essentially own them. One of the major challenges associated with using imaginary power as the basis for settling disputes and managing resources is that it's imaginary. It exists for no other reason than the fact that people are physiologically capable of thinking abstractly and adopting abstract belief systems. Because of the way our prefrontal cortices effortlessly engage in bidirectional abstract thinking and symbolic reasoning, people can and often do live their entire lives cognitively entrapped under these population-scale consensual hallucinations where it's impossible for them to see how vulnerable they are to psychological abuse and exploitation through their belief systems. Tragically, this also makes them incapable of seeing how easy it would be to escape their psychological entrapment. People will legitimately believe those who wear striped headcloths or lapel pins are actually powerful and fear their divine power over generations, birthing dynasties of oppressive god kings. Populations will labor for their god kings, kill for them, forfeit their resources to them, and even let their oppressors define what's right or good or fair. The cycle of human history. Hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. G. Michael Hopf, Those Who Remain. Across multiple generations, entire populations of agrarian sapiens will believe that imaginary logical constraints are viable substitutes for physical power as a mechanism for imposing physical costs on attackers. They will believe they have miraculously transcended natural selection and found a moral or ethical alternative with the same capacity for survival, moral or ethical according to whom. And then, once enough of the population has been convinced that they're secure against exploitation due to nothing more than the logical constraints encoded into rules of law, they self-domesticate, they become docile, they condemn physical confrontation and aggression. Instead of vectoring their resources to the most physically powerful, they socially exile them. They condemn them as warmongers. They place the people with real power at the bottom of their pecking order in favor of people with peaceful forms of imaginary power. The fossil record shows us what happens next. Either their own god-kings exploit, slaughter them, or their neighboring god-kings do. Human history seems to work in cycles where societies get comfortable and complacent with their high-functioning belief systems and stop projecting physical power to increase their CA. As they become increasingly more resource-abundant but increasingly less physically powerful and aggressive, their BCRA climbs. Not surprisingly, these societies get devoured by predators just like any other organism or organization in nature would. Meanwhile, societies which employ the grow CA first, then grow BA second strategy survive and become the new dominant society because they have the lowest BCRA, thus the highest prosperity margin. But this new society eventually becomes comfortable and complacent, stops increasing their CA, and the cycle repeats. When human populations become too docile or domesticated, either their territory gets physically captured or their belief system gets psychologically exploited. If the former, the population gets emergency drafted, misplaced, sent to labor camps, sent to mass early graves, or most likely starves. If the latter, the population gets systemically exploited and oppressed at extraordinary scales through their own belief systems, leaving them entrapped and enslaved with no capacity to understand what the root cause of their oppression is. During the collapse of these complex agrarian societies, maybe a few will have the intellectual humility to think twice about their decision to condemn physical power and aggression. Maybe they will stop and consider the idea that it was a mistake to adopt belief systems which require trust in untrustworthy people to function properly, and recognize that their beliefs in imaginary power, combined with their condemnation of physical power, led them straight to the slaughter. Rather than take accountability for their decisions and question the grossly unrealistic assumptions they made when they adopted their belief systems, many will instead choose to blame their invaders or their systemic oppressors for their losses. To their graves, they will continue to LARP like they ever had the option of living in a world without predators and entropy, as if they are the only organism in the world that doesn't have an intrinsic responsibility to keep themselves physically secure against attackers. They will masquerade like peaceful alternatives to physical conflicts ever existed at any time in history except temporarily, or at any place on this planet except exclusively within their imaginations. Such is the tragedy of domesticated sapiens and their willful ignorance of power projection tactics in modern society. Understanding the socio-technical differences between real power and imaginary power. A 10,000-year-old human fossil record shows evidence of the same pattern repeating itself over and over again, backed by an additional 5,000 years of written testimony. Bad things happen to those who forfeit their capacity and inclination to project physical power in favor of imaginary or abstract power. Good things happen to those who master their capacity and inclination to project physical power and impose severe physical costs on their attackers, whether the attacks come from inside or outside society. To recall a core concept from the previous chapter, we have highly randomized and variable data sets between many different agrarian societies who have tried many different experiments with many different resource management strategies. We can analyze these data ex post facto using statistical methods to find causally inferable relationships between physical power, physical aggression, and social prosperity. These causally inferable relationships can also be found in the animals we domesticate and slaughter on a regular basis. The proof is literally served to us on a silver platter. Yet somehow, sapient populations keep allowing themselves to fall into the exact same traps over and over again. Why is that? One explanation could be that because so few people in modern agrarian society devote themselves to the task of understanding and mastering physical power projection, they don't understand it. Combining this idea with the fact that most people don't think about their own metacognition, it could be the case that people are blissfully unaware of the fact that there are very clear, very measurable differences between physical power and abstract power, which explain their differences in complex emergent behavior. If that's the case, then we can explicitly call out the differences between real power and imaginary power so that people can better understand why they produce different emergent behavior. Once we understand how and why imaginary power and real power produce different emergent behavior, we can understand why abstract power hierarchies have so many dysfunctions which lead to war. Consider some of the characteristics of physical power using a real example. Picture Captain Elizabeth Eastman doing a pre-flight inspection of her physical power projection technology, an A-10 Thunderbolt II Warthog attack aircraft. Like all physical power, Captain Eastman's power is self-evident and self-legitimizing. People can instinctively recognize and verify the presence of her physical power. It's also exogenous to people's belief systems, making it invulnerable to systemic exploitation. Physical power is unsympathetic, meaning it works the same regardless of whether people believe in it or sympathize with it. More of it can't be created out of thin air, making it thermodynamically restricted. Its execution can't be reversed, making it path-dependent. Everyone is free to access and leverage Watts the same way she can, regardless of their rank, title, standing, or belief system, making it inclusive and egalitarian. Physical power is also unbounded. There's theoretically no limit to how many Watts people can use to defend themselves, particularly against her and her peers. Physical power also has a physical signature and leaves a blood trail, making it easy for people to see the threat and organize to defend against it. Table 2 provides a breakdown of these characteristics. Table 2. Characteristics of Captain Eastman's real or physical power. Systemic characteristic, self-evident and self-legitimizing. Description. People can instinctively recognize and respect her power based off its own merit, making it independently verifiable. Systemic characteristic, systemically exogenous. Description, derived from a source that is external to people's belief system, therefore it's impossible to be systemically exploited. Systemic characteristic, unsympathetic. Description, doesn't need people to believe in or sympathize with her power for it to function, functions the same for different people, different belief systems or sympathies. Systemic characteristic, physically constrainable. Description, in her operational domain of shared objective physical reality, there are a lot of ways to physically constrain her from using or scaling her power. Systemic characteristic, thermodynamically restricted. Description, more of this power can't be created out of thin air and awarded to people. If she is to have more of it, she must be intelligent and resourceful enough to master nature. Systemic characteristic, path-dependent. Description, the execution of her power cannot be reversed, appealed, or undone. Systemic characteristic, inclusive and egalitarian. Description, everyone can access to the same type of power she's using and countervail her with it regardless of their rank, title, standing, or belief system. Systemic characteristic, unbounded. Description, there is no limit to the amount of her type of power that people can use against her. Systemic characteristic, attributable. Description, because her power has a physical signature, that is blood trail, it's easy for people to see the threat of her power and organize to defend against it. Systemic characteristic, energy intensive. Description, requires a great deal of physical effort for her to exercise her power, creating a natural barrier to entry. Systemic characteristic directly leads to injury, if kinetic. Description, people directly get hurt when she exercises or mismanages her power, making it much easier for people to see and get upset by it, giving her lower margin for error. These characteristics could be described as useful features which enable physical power to function nicely as a zero-trust, permissionless, and egalitarian basis for settling intra-species disputes, establishing control authority over intra-species resources, and achieving consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of intra-species property in a way that is invulnerable to systemic exploitation of people's belief systems. The downside, of course, is that projecting physical power is energy-intensive and often leads to injury, if kinetic, hence why people are often motivated to seek alternative solutions to physical power projection. If we combine all these characteristics together, we can expect a socio-technical cooperation system that uses physical power to settle disputes, manage resources, and establish pecking order to have precisely the same kind of complex emergent behavior observed in the physical power projection competitions of nature, where those who emerge as the top power projectors have survived a rigorous but objectively fair natural selection process which separates those who are stronger, more intelligent, better organized, and more resourceful from those who are demonstrably unfit for survival. In direct contrast to real, physical power, we have abstract imaginary power. Consider the characteristics of abstract power using another real example. Picture Chief Justice Dudley presiding over the Supreme Court of Gibraltar. Like all abstract power, Chief Justice Dudley's power is imaginary. It doesn't physically exist anywhere except exclusively within people's collective imaginations. It's neither self-evident nor self-legitimizing, which means people can't instinctively recognize or independently verify it based off its own merit. It's also systemically endogenous to people's belief system, making it highly vulnerable to systemic exploitation and abuse. Chief Justice Dudley's abstract power is sympathetic. It requires people to believe in it and to be sympathetic to it, or else it doesn't function. It's also physically unconstrained. There is nothing physically limiting his imaginary power from scaling globally. The only constraints to his imaginary power are imaginary logical constraints encoded into a rule set he's not required to be sympathetic to, which are endogenous to the same belief system and therefore equally as vulnerable to systemic exploitation. His abstract power is also path-independent, making it reversible. At the same time, it's thermodynamically unsound because it can be created out of thin air. It's non-inclusive and inegalitarian because not everyone can have access to positions of high rank. There are also hard limits to the amount of imaginary power that people can use against him, making it bounded and giving him an upper hand. And because his power is imaginary, it has no physical signature and leaves no blood trail. This makes people less capable of detecting the threat of his power if it's used against them, making them less likely to be motivated to organize to countervail it. Table 3 provides a breakdown of these characteristics. Table 3. Characteristics of Chief Justice Dudley's imaginary abstract power. Systemic characteristic, neither self-evident nor self-legitimizing. Description. People can't instinctively recognize or respect his power based off its own merit, making it not independently verifiable. Systemic characteristic, systemically endogenous. Description. Because his power is internal to people's belief system, it can be systemically exploited, thus making it a form of psychological abuse of a population through their belief system. Systemic characteristic, sympathetic. Description. He needs people to believe in or sympathize with his power, else it won't function. It also doesn't function the same for different people with different belief systems or sympathies. Systemic characteristic, physically unconstrainable. Description. In his operational domain of shared subjective abstract reality, there is no way to physically constrain him from using or scaling his power. People must attempt to use logical constraints to constrain him, but those are demonstrably insecure against systemic exploitation, and they also require people to believe in or sympathize with them. Systemic characteristic, path-independent. Description. The execution of his power can be reversed, appealed, or undone. Systemic characteristic, thermodynamically unsound. Description. This power can be created out of thin air and awarded to people. He doesn't have to be intelligent and resourceful to master nature to have more of it. He just has to change the rules. Systemic characteristic, non-inclusive and inegalitarian. Description. Not everyone can have access to the same type of power he has without specific rank, title, standing, or belief system. Systemic characteristic, bounded. There are hard limits to the amount of his type of power that people can use against him. Systemic characteristic, non-attributable. Description. Because his power has no signature, that is, no blood trail, it's very hard for people to see the threat of his power, much less organized to defend against it. Systemic characteristic, non-energy intensive. Description. Requires minimal effort to exercise his power, removing natural barriers to entry. Systemic characteristic, indirectly leads to injury. Description. People indirectly get hurt when he exercises or mismanages his power, making it much harder for people to see and get upset by it, giving him far larger margin for error. Note how the socio-technical characteristics of imaginary power are mostly flaws. Because of these flaws, we can expect cooperation systems which use abstract power to settle intraspecies disputes, establish control authority over intraspecies resources, and achieve consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of intraspecies property to be dysfunctional and prone to systemic exploitation and abuse. Nevertheless, there are benefits to imaginary abstract power. For starters, this kind of power requires minimal energy to exercise and has practically no natural barriers to entry, making it extremely efficient and easy to adopt. It is also less directly attributable to physical injury, making it ostensibly more moral. In other words, because imaginary power doesn't involve physical confrontation, it's ostensibly good. However, the reader should note that the underlying argument of this thesis is that abstract power is so dysfunctional that it directly motivates people to engage in large-scale physical confrontations. Now that we have explicitly called out the socio-technical differences between real and imaginary power and shown how these are physically, systemically, and ontologically different things which should be expected to produce different complex emergent behavior, we can take some time to reflect on why people so commonly misunderstand them. This requires an even deeper look at sapient psychology and metacognition. Understanding the logical flaw of hypostatization. One of the most ubiquitous logical fallacies in modern agrarian society is a fallacy of ambiguity called hypostatization, where people construe a contextually subjective and complex abstraction, idea, or concept as a universal object. In plain terms, hypostatization is the mistake of believing something imaginary is something real. The fallacy of hypostatization is so common and ubiquitous in society that it's easy to forget it happens practically all the time. Similar to the saying about fish forgetting the presence of water, humans forget about the presence of hypostatization because they constantly think abstractly. Hypostatization is one of the most common logical fallacies, yet it's rarely discussed. Whole systems of philosophy, politics, religion, and social theories are built upon or supported by these fallacies. In his book Science and the Modern World, Alfred Whitehead warns of a very similar fallacy of misplaced concreteness, where people build elaborate logical constructions of a high degree of abstraction, which cause them to regard abstract beliefs and hypothetical constructs as if they were concrete things. This is another fallacy of ambiguity called reification. Whitehead summarizes the reification fallacy as simply the accidental error of mistaking the abstract for the concrete. The distinction between hypostatization and reification comes down to the type of abstractions involved, otherwise their definitions are virtually identical. Reification is commonly understood as a subset of hypostatization, where the abstractions which are fallaciously regarded as concrete things are either theological, philosophical, or ideological. For example, abstract constructs like good and justice are generated from theology, philosophy, or ideology. People who act like good and justice are concretely real things are guilty of reification because, technically speaking, good and justice are abstract concepts or beliefs which don't concretely exist in shared objective reality. Both hypostatization and reification are considered to be fallacies of ambiguity because they tend to happen when people get metaphors confused with literal meaning. Reification in literature, where it is ostensibly understood to be intended metaphorically or as a figure of speech, is encouraged and often considered to be good writing, so becomes very common in writing for cultural reasons. However, when hypostatization or reification occurs in logical arguments, it becomes a logical fallacy. Thus, both are regarded as fallacies of ambiguity because it can be ambiguous whether the author intended to speak metaphorically or intended to make a sincere logical argument. This ambiguity is often deliberate, such as when it's used in rhetoric. Rhetoric relies heavily on reification and will often use literary metaphors to present logical arguments to make them more thought-provoking and attention-capturing. Sapient neocortices crave their stories. Understanding the fallacy of hypostatization and reification are key to understanding why people can enjoy control authority over resources without using physical power. They create an abstract form of power like rank, title, or station, and then through hypostatization, people mistake their abstract power for a real thing. Practically all belief systems used to manage resources depend on hypostatization or reification of abstract power. Power which people think is concretely real, even though it technically exists nowhere except within their collective imaginations. This could be one reason why so few people talk about hypostatization despite its ubiquity. People in existing abstract power-based dominance hierarchies obviously wouldn't want their populations to think about how their abstract power isn't real. Legitimizing imaginary power using real power. Force, my friends, is violence, the supreme authority from which all other authorities are derived. Gene Raskzak, Starship Troopers. Another way to motivate people to hypostatize abstract power, other than by using persuasion or rhetoric, is by using physical power to legitimize it, rather than using theological, philosophical, and ideological arguments to convince people that one's abstract power is real. It's possible to create displays of physical power and then let your audience draw false positive correlations between two physically, systemically, and ontologically different things. To illustrate this point, consider the difference between kings and knights. We have established that a king's power is symbolic, not physically real. Yet, sapiens have a clear tendency to cherish the symbolic world in their heads more than the physical one in front of their eyes. Being a modern human often means hypostatizing or reifying abstract constructs and then role-playing as if the abstractions are concretely real things. This behavior is why, if you choose to disobey the king, you have a high probability of being injured by LARPers who actually wield real power. Knights. Knights are people who have volunteered to subscribe to a belief system where kings have abstract power. Some of them may even believe that the king's abstract power is concretely real. Because people subscribe to these belief systems, they are willing to shape physically objective reality ex post facto to match what exists exclusively within their imagination. So, for example, storytelling kings will claim that disobedient people, that is, people who have not subscribed to the same belief system as them, should be physically constrained or have their rank demoted to prisoner for being unsympathetic to the orders of the king. In response, knights will use their physical power to legitimize the king's abstract power by making shared objective physical reality match their shared subjective abstract reality. This process of using physical power to legitimize abstract power is more commonly known as enforcement. The name literally means to introduce force. In other words, the name means to inject real power into a situation where only imaginary power was previously being exercised. Enforcement is noteworthy because it shows the two aforementioned use cases of physical power projection occurring simultaneously. 1. Imposing physically prohibitive cost. And 2. Creating a proof of power, aka proof of real signal. The knight's power is not only projected to increase the CA and lower the BCRA of undermining an abstract belief system, but it's also projected to produce a proof of real signal to motivate people to draw false positive conclusions about the realness of the king's abstract power. In the first use case, physical power is projected to impose severe physical costs on people who don't subscribe to the same belief system and therefore aren't sympathetic to or influenced by the king's abstract power. As mentioned in the previous section, imaginary power is sympathetic. It needs people to believe in it or sympathize with it, or else it will not function properly. Therefore, not being sympathetic to the king's abstract power is a direct threat to the functionality of his entire abstract power hierarchy and could expose that the king doesn't actually have real power. The solution is to impose real-world physical costs on those who are unsympathetic to the king's orders. This not only decreases the benefit-to-cost ratio of undermining the king's orders, but it also causes bystanders to hypostatize his imaginary power as something physically real. People are inclined to believe the king's imaginary power is real for the same reason they are inclined to believe a harmless stack of sticks is a deadly snake. Our brains produce false positive correlations between abstract thoughts, for example, the imaginary power of the king, and sensory inputs, for example, the physically power of the knights, because natural selection has caused our brains to take abstract imaginary things as seriously as physically real things. People are quick to hypostatize the king's imaginary power as real power, because the knight's physical power projection manually generates a cross-referenceable physical sensory input to match the king's claim about having real power. In essence, enforcement leverages the same realness verification algorithm people use when they poke something or pinch themselves to generate haptic feedback. Knights manually generate force to displace mass over time to produce a proof-of-power signal of realness, the exact same way that people poke things or pinch themselves to produce a proof-of-power signal of realness. The main difference is that the proof-of-power signal comes from a third party, much like how actual haptic feedback systems work, and the amount of power used doesn't cause injury. As a quick side note, while the author was writing this, the founder of the Oculus virtual reality system claims to have designed a haptic feedback system for virtual reality gamers that physically harms, kills the wearer. The idea being that it makes the gaming experience feel more real and materially consequential. This is a perfect demonstration of the proof of power equals proof of real concept discussed here. A haptic feedback system which physically kills a gamer if they die in-game is, in essence, an enforcement system which works exactly the same as a knight who kills a citizen for disobeying the king. Both scenarios represent a situation where physical power is used to make something abstract feel more real, since the virtual reality of a video game is, by definition, just as abstract as a king's imaginary power. Since physical power is path-dependent and self-legitimizing, a virtual reality gaming system which utilizes physical power to kill its wearer if they die in-game inherits the systemic properties of the physical power it utilizes to make the game more path-dependent and legitimately hazardous. The physical power produced by a knight works exactly like a lethal haptic feedback system for virtual reality gaming systems. It provides a synchronous cross-referenceable signal of realness to match the king's abstract power. In other words, proof of power produces a proof of real signal. At the same time, the population contributes to the illusion. Other people subscribe to the same belief system that says the king's power is physically real, steering everyone's combined physical action to shape objective reality to match what is otherwise just an abstraction. As a result, the population is quick to lose sight of the fact that all abstract power held by all people of all ranks in all abstract power-based dominance hierarchies exist within the imagination only. None of it is physically real, no matter how many people LARP like it real or use real-world physical power to make it look and feel more real. The combined effect is a population-scale consensual hallucination which can gaslight the public into believing in the divine strength of God, kings. Metacognitively speaking, people who believe their king's power is real behave similarly to people who put on virtual reality headsets and accidentally run into a wall. People are quick to make false positive correlations between abstract inputs and sensory inputs. The result of enforcement is compliance with the king's orders. People who blatantly undermine the king's rank are physically punished for not recognizing his imaginary power by obeying his orders. This, combined with routine physical shows of force, makes people quick to commit the logical fallacy of believing the king's imaginary power is something concretely real. People will sincerely believe they are being physically compelled to behave some way merely by virtue of reading about it or watching physical power projectors march around on a computer screen despite never having been involved in any physical confrontation. As another side note, this is why some regimes love military parades. These parades are marketed as a show of force to foreign nations and a way to comfort a proud population about how secure they are. But in actuality, a hidden purpose of the parade is for the regime to produce a proof of power signal for their own populations, to motivate them to hypostatize the regime's abstract power as real power, and make them less motivated to resist the regime. Illegitimatizing imaginary power using real power. The world will know that free men stood against a tyrant, that few stood against many, and before this battle is over, that even a god can bleed. Leonidas, 300. U.S. President Kennedy was among the most abstractly powerful people to have ever lived when he was assassinated in 1963. Incidentally, Kennedy's assassination occurred just 5 months after signing Executive Order 11110, which journalists have argued was an attempt to rein in the abstract power of the Federal Reserve. In his book Crossfire, Jim Marrs presents the argument that President Kennedy attempted to replace the purchasing power of Federal Reserve notes, that is money issued and controlled by the Federal Reserve, a private institution, with silver certificates, that is money issued and controlled by the U.S. Department of Treasury, a public institution with the deferred abstract power of the U.S. President. In other words, the logic encoded into Executive Order 11110 would have stripped the abstract power of the Federal Reserve to make money and given it back to the U.S. government. For that reason, journalists have argued that the Federal Reserve Bank, most notably the bank's anonymous shareholders who receive interest off their notes lent to the U.S. government, would have had the largest financial motive to contribute to President Kennedy's assassination, as Executive Order 11110 would have undermined their monopoly control over the U.S. monetary system. Of course, people can only speculate as to the true motive behind JFK's assassination, and there is no shortage of conspiracies related to the topic. But no matter what the true motives for JFK's assassination was, it very clearly demonstrated how physical power is both superior to and unsympathetic to abstract power. President Kennedy had far higher rank and far more abstract power than the person who took his rank and abstract power from him, but it didn't protect him because abstract power is merely imaginary power. Rank doesn't stop a speeding bullet. If, purely for the sake of illustrating a core concept of this grounded theory, we assume that people associated with the Federal Reserve Bank were indeed behind JFK's assassination because of financial motives, then JFK's assassination would represent a scenario that demonstrates how physical power both legitimizes and delegitimizes abstract power simultaneously. To fire a bullet is to project physical power kinetically for the purpose of imposing severe physical costs on neighboring organisms. In this scenario, the bullet which delegitimized the abstract power of the U.S. president would have simultaneously legitimized the abstract power of the Federal Reserve, because 4 months after Kennedy's assassination, the redemption of silver certificates for silver dollars was irrevocably halted, implicitly restoring the Federal Reserve's monopoly control over the U.S. monetary system. As the demise of any leader at the top of any abstract power hierarchy has shown, of which there have been many examples, President Kennedy merely being the most recent one in our particular abstract power hierarchy, as easily as physical power can be used to legitimize abstract power, it can also be used to delegitimize abstract power. King Leonidas famously highlighted this concept in the movie 300 when he suggested that an effective way to undermine the legitimacy of God King Xerxes' hypostatized power is to make Xerxes bleed. This concept demonstrates yet another application of physical power. Physical power not only serves as a proof of real protocol, but it can also serve as a proof of not real protocol that illegitimatizes people's claims to abstract power. This function alone explains why many wars are fought. In almost all cases of large-scale human versus human conflict, people try to either legitimize or delegitimize the abstract powers assigned to a given belief system. A technical name for this concept is power hypostatization, the act of believing that abstract power is concretely real power. The pitfall of power hypostatization is twofold. First, as illustrated in the previous subsection, the human tendency for power hypostatization motivates people to project physical power to convince a population to believe in their abstract power. Second, as illustrated in this subsection, power hypostatization simultaneously motivates people to project physical power to convince a population not to believe in someone's abstract power. In both cases, physical power is used to either legitimize or illegitimize abstract power, resulting in a kinetically destructive war. Power hypostatization is, of course, a glaring logical flaw. The flawed reasoning is easy to point out just by asking a few simple questions. For example, if the God King's power were concretely real, then why isn't it self-evident? Why does he need an army in the first place? Remove the knights, and there would be little confusion about the existence of the king's power. Without knights, it would be trivial to see that the king is, in fact, physically powerless. There would be no sensory input available to cross-reference the king's imaginary power with the knight's real power, thus no way for the mind to produce the false positive correlations that lead to power hypostatization. In a world where the people at the top of the abstract power hierarchies actually had the power people claim they have, there would be no such thing as assassinations or revolutions or foreign invasions. An all-powerful God King wouldn't need to hire an army to fight a war for him. He would only need to snap his almighty finger. The fact that wars exist is therefore a direct byproduct of the fact that abstract power doesn't. The concept of power hypostatization highlights the metacognitive function of phenomena like enforcement and military shows of force. Metacognition, thinking about how humans think, helps us understand the primary value-delivered function of enforcement and military shows of force. These are both psychological techniques designed to influence people's behavior by getting them to either hypostatize abstract power as concretely real power or to snap out of their consensual hallucinations and recognize that abstract power and real power are not the same kind of power, thus they don't have the same emergent behavior. As anyone who has ever experienced a military show of force maneuver can attest, for example warning shots or low-altitude flybys of military aircraft, these are the moments where people wake up from their imaginary belief systems about power and realize that things just got real. A primary difference between what populations consider to be illegitimate and legitimate belief systems or legal policies, aka a generic set of rules versus the rule of law, is the amount real-world physical power projected by people to enforce and secure those policies. The author could easily design a set of rules to encode his own abstract power-based dominance hierarchy and place himself at the top of it, but people are probably not going to subscribe to the belief system that the author is actually powerful, because the author lacks both the physical power and the storytelling capacity to convince people to believe his story. As an example of this concept, the abstract powers encoded by the U.S. Constitution are backed by the U.S. military. When people of high rank try to undermine the U.S. Constitution, the U.S. military's job is to step in and remind them that the abstract power of the U.S. Constitution is backed by real power of the U.S. military, and that real power is non-negotiable regardless of how unsympathetic people are to it. The most recent example where this happened was following the U.S. Capitol insurrection during the inauguration proceedings of President-elect Biden. In an unprecedented and thinly veiled warning by the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, the American public, to include the sitting Commander-in-Chief, were explicitly reminded that the armed forces of the United States remain fully committed to protecting and defending the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and that, in accordance with the Constitution, President-elect Biden will be inaugurated. Here, the Joint Chiefs explicitly reminded the public that their job is to physically secure the abstract powers encoded by the U.S. Constitution against foreign and domestic enemies, that is, against U.S. citizens and even the sitting Commander-in-Chief, if necessary, if they were to continue to organize and illegitimize the U.S. constitutional process using physical confrontation. The phenomenon of power hypostatization is also why U.S. military service members do not have the same freedom of speech rights as civilians do, most notably the right to speak contemptuously towards public officials regardless of rank. In other words, people wielding physical power on behalf of the U.S. are not legally allowed to speak contemptuously towards people wielding abstract power on behalf of the U.S., because physical power illegitimatizes abstract power and represents an existential threat to the existing abstract power hierarchy. Military service members are special in that they wield real power. It's one thing to have a politician speak contemptuously towards other politicians, as they often do, but it's an entirely different thing to have a commander of military forces speak contemptuously towards a politician. Almost every time this happens, the officer is quickly fired. A general has a lot more physical power backing up his rank than that of other civilian officials with similar rank. Because military forces are actually powerful, it would be inappropriate for military officers to speak contemptuously towards public officials, as that represents a direct threat to the abstract power of the existing abstract power hierarchy. To see a manifestation of this concept, watch any State of the Union address and take note of the Joint Chiefs. The reader will notice that the Joint Chiefs wear poker faces and scarcely react to any of the statements made by any Commander-in-Chief. This is to avoid non-verbally signaling approval or disapproval of anything spoken by their ranking officer during the public address. Now compare the Joint Chiefs' reactions to those in the audience who only wield abstract power, and the reader will notice a stark difference. Congressional members constantly signal their approval or disapproval of what is said during the public address, both verbally and non-verbally. History has shown us many times that people with close connections to standing armies wielding real power are a clear and present danger to high-ranking members of any abstract power hierarchy. Smooth-talking generals who speak contemptuously about their government's public officials have a well-documented tendency to eventually delegitimize their abstract power-based dominance hierarchies. All one has to do is read Cicero to get a play-by-play account of what it looks like when the imaginary power of senators operating in a republic gets usurped by smooth-talking generals calling themselves emperor. One way to mitigate this threat is to logically constrain the speech of military officers via laws which prohibit them from speaking contemptuously towards public officials who wield abstract power. Making it illegal for military officers to speak contemptuously towards public officials serves as a stopgap or interlocking safety mechanism that gives high-ranking people the legal justification they need to fire or incarcerate an emerging threat before they have time to organize a military insurrection. This sometimes works to nip the threat of coup d'état in the bud before it blossoms, but it isn't always effective. Military insurrections can and do still happen, hence why the United States of America exists in the first place. Political assassinations and military insurrections showcase how real power trumps imaginary power whenever they come head-to-head. Many high-ranking people have relearned this lesson the hard way. A contributing factor to this problem appears to be that high-ranking people have a tendency to start believing in their own abstract power. They self-hypostatize their imaginary power as concretely real power. They make the critical mistake of believing the abstract powers granted to them by their rank is a concretely real thing, and they lose sight of the fact that they are physically powerless to do anything without other people who believe in their imaginary power and do the real power projection for them. As history testifies, the resource control authority afforded to abstract power hierarchies like monarchies only exist insofar as the ruled class, not the ruling class, is 1. Willing to believe in the monarchy's abstract power, and 2. Willing to back it with their own sweat and blood. Undermine the real power projectors, and the king's control authority over the population's valuable resources swiftly disappears, as it has for several monarchies throughout history. This is how new abstract power hierarchies like the US are born. Americans are first and foremost insurrectionists who used real power to delegitimize the abstract power of their oppressive king. The US is proof of the concept that physical power trumps imaginary power. Metcalfe's law works both ways. Belief in abstract power can disappear as quickly as it appears. In addition to having their abstract power physically illegitimatized, a king can also have their imaginary power suddenly vanish simply because of reverse network effects. In other words, a king can have their abstract power cancelled if they become too abusive with it. The simple explanation for this is that Metcalfe's law works both ways. Just as non-linearly as the value of a belief system can grow as the number of believers grows linearly, the value of a belief system can also fall non-linearly as its number of believers decreases. For this reason, it can be surprising how quickly the abstract power of a king or government can vanish from people's collective imagination once enough of the population realizes it is in their best interest to stop believing in it. Countless revolutions have shown very clearly that it takes far less time to dissolve an abstract belief system than it does to establish it. This same phenomenon manifests itself in the modern age as cancel culture. A king can lose the power he spent decades building just by saying or doing one wrong thing to have power broadly questioned. For these reasons, rulers who seek to preserve their abstract power and control authority over resources would be wise not to forget about network effects or do anything to motivate mass defection. Rulers who prosper are rulers who understand they don't have real power, they just have abstract power like rank. And there are major systemic differences between these two different types of power. Creating abstract power. The truth is, one who seeks to achieve freedom by petitioning those in power to give it to him has already failed, regardless of the response. To beg for the blessing of authority is to accept that the choice is the master's alone to make, which means that the person is already, by definition, a slave. Larkin Rose. To wield abstract power over people, convince them they need your permission or approval. To seek permission or social approval from someone is to tacitly give them abstract power over you. On the flip side, if you want to create and wield abstract power over a large population of humans, simply convince them to adopt a belief system where they need permission or social approval from you. Once a population believes they need your permission or approval, you have successfully gained abstract power and influence over them. It should be noted that abstract power is a relatively new phenomenon. Evidence of abstract power appears quite recently in the human fossil record. An easy way to detect when humans started believing in abstract power is when they started giving some sapiens far more materially grandiose burial rituals than other sapiens. Pre-Neolithic society appears to have been largely rankless, with what anthropologist Peter Turchin describes as remarkably cooperative and egalitarian societies, with leaders who could not order their followers around, leading instead by example. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in rankless societies like this, with very few distinctions beyond age, gender, and earned reputation. Everyone had a similar burial ritual. Then, starting in the Neolithic age after the invention of agriculture, disproportionately gaudy graves emerged, packed full of gold and other precious resources. God kings wielding enormous amounts of reified abstract power emerged. Not surprisingly, they exploited people with their imaginary power. As Turchin describes, they oppressed us, enslaved us, and sacrificed us on the altars of bloodthirsty gods. They filled their palaces with treasures and their harems with the most beautiful women in the land. They claimed to be living gods and forced us to worship them. Based on nothing more than artifacts dug up from the ground, we can observe that several thousand years ago, people suddenly learned that they could psychologically exploit their peers through their mutually adopted belief systems, and they've been doing it ever since. Somewhere along the path of sapient abstract thinking and cultural evolution, the practice of storytelling went from Paleolithic shamans describing the mysteries of the afterlife and imbuing the tribe with symbolic meaning to God, kings using rhetoric and written languages to convince thousands of people to mistake their imaginary forms of abstract power for something concretely real, then using that abstract power to gain and exploit control authority over the entire population's resources. The modern abstract power hierarchies we live in today are derived from a similar style of ideological gatekeeping which god kings first mastered in early civilization. The general approach to creating and wielding abstract power appears to be largely the same as it started at least as early as 75,000 years ago. Creating abstract power can be described as a four-step process listed below. Step 1. Use storytelling skills to convince a population to adopt a belief system with a desired theological, philosophical, or ideological state of being. The existence of a desired state of being implicitly defines the existence of an undesired state of being, with a discrete separation between the two states of being. In this example, this discrete separation is abstracted as a gate. Step 2. Use storytelling skills to convince people there's a method, path, or gateway to reach the desired state of being. Step 3. Use storytelling skills to name yourself the gatekeeper who can generously lead people through the gate to achieve the desired state of being. This is a subversive form of abstract power building which distracts a population from seeing that you tacitly gave yourself denial of service power, which you can use to passive-aggressively revoke people's access to the desired state of being. Step 4. Increase the adoption of your belief system. The first step of creating abstract power is to use one's storytelling and rhetorical skills, applications of abstract thinking discussed in previous section, to construct a desirable theological, philosophical, or ideological state of being, then convince people it's a real thing via reification. For most of written history, this desired abstract state of being has been described as a place, a paradise of some kind, usually in the afterlife. As society becomes gradually less theological, the desirable state of being has become gradually more ideological, but equally abstract. Instead of wanting to go to heaven, for example, people often want to be moral or ethical and will hypostatize, reify constructs like universal moral good as something concretely real. The desired of being is often described as an all-or-nothing phenomenon rather than a spectrum. It's usually either 0 or 1. You're either in paradise or you're not. You're either moral or you aren't. It's important for the desired state to be discretely separable, that is Boolean, like this because the creation of a discretely true state automatically implies the existence of a discretely false state. This way, the presence of a desired state, for example, saved, divine, favored by the gods, moral, tacitly implies the existence of an undesirable state, for example, not saved, not divine, not favored by the gods, immoral, as well as a discrete boundary between the two states which subtly and passive-aggressively denies unqualified people from reaching the desired state. If we recall the discussion on abiogenesis and passive-aggressive power projection tactics like pressurized membranes and colonization attacks in the previous chapter, this is essentially an abstract version of the same power projection tactic. Once people have adopted a belief system where there are two discretely separate states of being, that is good and bad, and we have convinced enough of the population to hypostatize or reify things like good and bad as concretely real things, the second step of creating and wielding abstract power is to imply there's a way to get from the undesired state, for example bad, to the desired state, for example good. The population must believe there's a gateway to good, otherwise it would be impossible to execute the third and probably most important step to creating abstract power. The third step to creating abstract power is to make oneself the Sherpa or gatekeeper who is uniquely qualified to lead people from the undesired state, for example bad, to the desired state, for example good. By becoming the Sherpa or gatekeeper, a person can wield abstract power passive-aggressively in the form of denial of service, DOS, attacks. Moral gatekeepers implicitly have the authority to deny people's access to the population's mutually desired state of being by simply saying someone doesn't qualify for it. In other words, the person nominated to be the moral judge has the ability to judge someone as immoral and thus outcast them. As an added bonus, this tacit and passive-aggressive abstract power projection tactic is easy for gatekeepers to disguise as benevolence, making it even more subversive and effective. People are quick to believe in desired states of being, for example moral, good, holy, due to theological, philosophical, or ideological reasons, and quick to see their theological, philosophical, or ideological gatekeepers as people who generously lead others to desired theological, philosophical, or ideological paradise. These people are oblivious to the fact that moral gatekeepers are people who tacitly wield passive-aggressive power to socially outcast anyone they choose. The point is so important that it bears repeating. To seek permission or special approval from someone is to tacitly give them abstract power over you. As soon as a population nominates someone to be their gatekeeper, they become subservient to that gatekeeper. The fourth step to creating abstract power is straightforward. Convince as many people to adopt the belief system as possible. Because it's easy to disguise the gatekeeper's passive-aggressive, hypostatized, reified, abstract power as benevolence, it's easy to motivate people to expand the reach of the gatekeeper's abstract power because they will believe they are helping their peers. Followers of any given belief system will be inclined to spread the good news that they have discovered the path to a theological, philosophical, or ideological paradise, and all people must do to get there is do whatever the benevolent gatekeeper says to do. Pay no attention to the elephant in the room. The fact that we are handing a person the means to psychologically exploit and abuse the population, using moral ambiguity, politicking, and demagoguery to grow abstract power. As previously discussed, hypostatization reification is often intended to be a figure of speech, but some people use it in rhetoric to convince people to reach fallacious conclusions through thinly veiled logical arguments. This commonly happens in politicking when people use rhetoric to assert that something has theological, philosophical, or ideological qualities such as moral value, and then use moral value as the logical basis for their argument. This is problematic because morals are abstract constructs. They have no capacity to be causally efficacious, and they are ontologically independent from what we currently understand to be objective reality. Moreover, it's incontrovertibly recognized that hypostatization is a fallacy when used in logical arguments. The most insidious use of hypostatization or reification, often employed by demagogues, occurs when something intended to be taken as a logical argument is disguised as a series of moral or ethically charged metaphors. This could explain why people who seek to create abstract power often speak in metaphors. The true intent of these metaphors is to present a logical argument to persuade the audience to adopt a given belief system for which they're the gatekeeper who decides what right is, but the logical argument is deliberately ambiguated as a story or series of metaphors to either 1. Disguise the orator's unsound and fallacious logic, 2. Preemptively hedge against anticipated critical examination of the orator's logic, 3. Make a more entertaining, motivating, or persuasive speech, or 4. Appeal to the desires and prejudices of ordinary people. To illustrate the ambiguous nature of rhetoric, consider President John F. Kennedy's famous inaugural address written by Theodore Sorensen, perhaps most remembered for its "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country" statement. This chain of logic suggests American citizens exist for the sake of serving their government, which is directly contradictory to the philosophical intent of the American Constitution and the Founding Fathers, who proposed the exact opposite theory that governments exist to serve the people. As previously discussed, Americans are insurrectionists, people who are overtly defiant to abstract power, dismissive of rank, disloyal to their king, capable of and highly motivated to kill thousands of redcoats to delegitimize their oppressive king's abstract power. The U.S. Constitution gives American citizens the right to free speech and the right to bear arms for the explicit purpose of empowering American citizens to delegitimize the abstract power of their government if it becomes too abusive or systemically exploitative, just like the British monarchy did in the 1700s. Of course, President Kennedy was probably just being rhetorical to inspire the audience to understand the importance of civic action and public service. The point is that nobody can really know what his intentions were because of moral ambiguity. It's impossible to know whether the president was trying to inspire the audience to take civic action, or he was intentionally trying to present a blatantly un-American or non-constitutional argument and passive-aggressively imply that citizens are immoral unless they devote themselves to the service of their state. Moral ambiguity is still a relevant issue today. For example, patriotism is commonly used as a form of ideological gatekeeping for demagogues to create and wield abstract power. Signs of people exploiting or abusing their abstract powers. I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love. King George III, Hamilton the Musical. The principles of system security apply to belief systems just as much as they apply to physical system security. It is important to be aware of one's own mental models and to guard against the threat of psychological exploitation and abuse of one's belief system. The reader is invited to reflect on signs of theological, philosophical, or ideological gatekeeping, intentional reification, politicking, moral ambiguity, demagoguery, or other examples of people trying to create abstract power so they can exploit it. There are clear signs of people trying to create and wield abstract power. People will claim there is a paradise in the afterlife, even though they can't see, smell, touch, taste, or hear it. People will claim there is an objectively moral or ethical good, even though it can't be seen, smelled, touched, tasted, or heard. People will imply there are discrete differences between heaven and hell, moral and immoral, ethical and unethical. People will imply they get to decide what behavior qualifies as moral or immoral, ethical or unethical, or worthy of heaven or hell. Then, either directly or in some passive-aggressive way, storytellers will attempt to use their rhetoric to persuade you that you are guilty of being immoral or unethical, or you are destined to go to hell unless you behave the way they say you ought to behave, unless you follow some set of rules. They say you have a moral obligation to follow unless you adopt their belief system. Once you adopt these belief systems, you must understand that you have tacitly given them a form of passive-aggressive, abstract power over you. You have entered a permission-based belief system where you tacitly need the permission and approval of the moral gatekeepers. This is a generalized approach that humans use to create and wield abstract power over other humans by exploiting them through their abstract belief systems. This is how most abstract power-based dominance hierarchies are formed. All abstract power hierarchies introduce a psychological attack vector in the form of systemic exploitation of people's belief systems. Does this mean all abstract power hierarchies are systemically exploitative? Not necessarily, but it does mean they can be systemically exploited. These types of belief systems rely on trusting in people with imaginary power. Whether or not abstract power hierarchies descend into a state of psychological exploitation and abuse depends upon the population's ability to recognize the signs of it happening. Unlike the abuse of physical power, the abuse of abstract power can scale far higher, far faster, and be far harder to recognize because it doesn't leave a blood trail. Abstract power hierarchies. What good is title if you have to earn it? Sir Walter Elliot. Persuasion. nothing but stories told by storytellers. We have established that sapiens are unique in comparison to other species in nature because of how much they rely on abstract sources of power to form their dominance hierarchies rather than physical power to form their dominance hierarchies. Sapiens have been behaving this way since at least the dawn of the Neolithic era. If the previously mentioned anthropological theories are true, then using abstract power to form dominance hierarchies became popular because they gave people a way to avoid physical confrontation while simultaneously helping them to emotionally reconcile the cognitive dissonance they were feeling about their domestication of animals and mass destruction of surrounding flora and fauna. It is clear from the fossil record that humans started believing in abstract power and using it to form their dominance hierarchies thousands of years before the invention of written language, thus thousands of years before sapiens were even capable of formally encoding the logic of their abstract power hierarchies using rules of law. Written language is what gave sapiens the means to begin formally codifying the logic of their abstract beliefs using syntactically and semantically complex logic. Today, we call this formally encoded design logic rules of law. As previously mentioned, one of the major benefits of storytelling is that it allows people to transcend their physical constraints and cooperate on much larger scales. Written language was a storytelling game changer when it comes to getting people to adopt common belief systems about abstract power, because written languages transcend the need for synchronous communication of stories. Write something down, and that story can be shared asynchronously with unlimited people without the author needing to be present or even alive. People with abstract power took advantage of written language to convince more people to believe in their abstract power. This means written language was yet another power projection tactic. To this day, written language still remains one of the most potent power projection tactics in human society, hence why the pen is often considered to be mightier than the sword. Not surprisingly, the ability to read and write increased the likelihood of having abstract power and control authority over people's valuable resources. Literacy, especially the ability to read and write laws, translates directly to abstract power. Practically as soon as people learned how to write, they started writing rules of law which placed themselves at the top of an abstract power hierarchy. Alternatively, if their attempts to give themselves abstract power were too obvious, people would use their reading and writing skills to place a god at the top of the abstract power hierarchy and subversively imply they were God's formally chosen representative, implicitly giving themselves access to God's abstract power. There are several different ways to create and award oneself with abstract power, but the bottom line is that the people who write the stories and make the laws had a clear tendency to become the rulers. Literacy therefore translates directly into the ability to build empires and exploit populations through their belief systems at unprecedented scale. We have established that abstract power and abstract power hierarchies are nothing but belief systems. They are elaborate logical constructions with high degrees of abstraction passed down over thousands of generations of storytelling. Symbols of this abstract power can be pressed into clay, written on parchment, worn as a crown, or encoded into a computer, but the abstract power they wield exists nowhere except within the minds of sapiens, the only place where it isn't both physically powerless and objectively meaningless. Because people mistakenly hypostatize abstract power as real power, people tend to forget this. As more people treat abstract power as a concretely real thing, they proceed to act like it is a concretely real thing, and that combined action convinces others it's a concretely real thing. Eventually, everyone just starts acting like abstract power is a real thing without questioning it. Creating abstract power is therefore a fake it until you make it phenomenon. People can fake like they have real power until people start acting like they have real power and eventually project real power for them, creating a self-perpetuating cycle. This phenomenon is commonly seen today with celebrity influencers, people who are famous for being famous. Early god kings were similar to celebrity influencers, and the written languages they used to create and expand their abstract power was a way to make their influence go viral faster. This is a very important concept to note because in the next chapter, the author will describe how this is exactly what's happening following the invention of a new language called machine code and a new form of literacy that gives people control over people's computers and digital information. The bottom line up front is that software represents a new way for people to encode abstract power hierarchies which place themselves at the top of those abstract power hierarchies. The argument will be made that computer programs give 21st century humans the ability to create and wield abstract power at unprecedented scale. But before we get there, we need to develop a thorough understanding about the abstract power hierarchies formed in previous centuries. Types of abstract power hierarchies. The first centralized societies appeared in Mesopotamia at least as early as 6,000 years ago and evolved into the first cities and states around 5,000 years ago. With the invention of written language during this same time frame, these abstract power hierarchies were formally codified into written rule sets we now call rules of law, marking the beginning of written history. Not surprisingly, the design philosophy of these abstract power hierarchies was rooted in theology, philosophy, and ideology. They rely on having someone declare the right way to settle disputes, establish control authority over property, and achieve consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of property. The people with the highest rank at the top of these abstract power hierarchies are ostensibly the best qualified people to know what right is. To use the terminology from the previous section, the highest-ranking members are the gatekeepers from whom the population seeks permission and approval. Over time, the abstract power wielded by high-ranking people within their abstract power hierarchies get hypostatized. Their imaginary power began to look and feel physically real because everybody started thinking and acting like it were real. This still holds true today. Theological, philosophical, and ideological gatekeepers start to look powerful because our peers start thinking and acting like they're powerful. Fast forward through thousands of years of storytelling, and this process has produced many different types of abstract power hierarchies involving many different types of high-ranking people who wield many types of abstract power. Regardless of their structure, all abstract power hierarchies effectively work the same way. The people at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy must have permission and approval from the people at the top of the dominance hierarchy. In other words, all abstract power hierarchies are permission-based systems. The people at the top of these hierarchies are the people who are supposedly the most qualified to determine what permissions and approvals the rest of the population ought to have. This means all abstract power hierarchies are simultaneously trust-based systems. The people at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy must trust that the people at the top are indeed the most qualified to determine what permissions the population ought to have. The people at the bottom of the dominance hierarchy must also trust that the people at the top won't deliberately withhold their permission and approval, nor systemically exploit the population with their special permission and approval capabilities. Therein lies the massive systemic security flaw of all abstract power hierarchies. The first types of people from which populations sought permission and approval appear to be Paleolithic shamans. These shamans were eventually replaced by Neolithic priests and god kings. By the Bronze and Iron Ages, cultural evolution and a whole lot of physical conflict changed god kings into regular kings, senators, or emperors. Today, the highest-ranking positions wielding the most amount of abstract power are called kings, presidents, senators, and prime ministers. These high-ranking positions sit within the formally encoded abstract power hierarchies described in Table 4. Table 4. Examples of modern-day abstract power hierarchy designs. Abstract power hierarchy design, presidential republic. How the abstract power is encoded into the design. Head of state is a president that serves as the head of government, exercises abstract power alongside an independent legislature. Example: United States of America, Mexico, most countries in South America. Abstract power hierarchy. Design: semi-presidential republic. How the abstract power is encoded into the design. Head of state is a president who has some executive powers, exercises abstract power alongside an independent legislature. Remaining abstract power of the president is invested in a ministry that is subject to parliamentary confidence. Example: France, Russia, Ukraine, Mongolia, South Korea. Abstract power hierarchy. Design: republic, executive presidency nominated elected by a legislature. How the abstract power is encoded into the design. President is both head of state and government. The ministry, including the president, may or may not be subject to parliamentary confidence. Example: South Africa, Botswana, Guyana. Abstract power hierarchy. Design: parliamentary republic. How the abstract power is encoded into the design. Head of state is a president who is mostly or entirely ceremonial. Ministry is subject to parliamentary confidence. Example: Germany, Italy, India. Abstract power hierarchy. Design: constitutional monarchy. How the abstract power is encoded into the design. Head of state is a monarch that is mostly or entirely ceremonial. Ministry is subject to parliamentary confidence. Example: United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Spain, Norway, Sweden. Abstract power hierarchy. Design: semi-constitutional monarchy. How the abstract power is encoded into the design. Head of state is an executive monarch who personally exercises abstract power in concert with other institutions. Example: Morocco, Jordan, Qatar, United Arab Emirates. Abstract power hierarchy. Design: absolute monarchy. How the abstract power is encoded into the design. Head of state is executive with all authority invested in a monarch. Example: the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Oman. Abstract power hierarchy. Design: one-party state. How the abstract power is encoded into the design. Head of state is executive or ceremonial. Abstract power is constitutionally linked to a single political movement. Example: China, North Korea, Vietnam. Something important to note about today's abstract power hierarchies is that they're exponentially more centralized and asymmetrically powerful now than they have ever been in the history of human civilization. The valuable resources of approximately 8 billion people are now controlled by something like 10,000 high-ranking people across the world who have the overwhelming majority of all abstract power. While highly energy efficient, this type of social system comes at the cost of creating systemic security vulnerabilities. Never in human history have so many valuable resources been more centrally controlled by such a small ruling class. It would have been mathematically impossible in the past due to population size, even though there were a larger number of independent city-states. People are living in an abstract belief system where the combined global resources of all sapiens are governed by only 0.0001% of its population. Modeling the differences between physical power-based and abstract power-based resource control. The abstract power-based APB dominance hierarchies created by behaviorally modern sapiens can be modeled as resource control structures. APB resource control structures that sapiens use have the same function as the physical power-based PPB resource control structures of other species modeled in the previous chapter. This means we can compare the APB resource control system created by Neolithic sapiens to the PPB resource control system created by natural selection to gain some additional insight about how and why human attempts to establish their dominance hierarchy using something other than physical power can result in different complex emergent behavior. At first glance, PPB and APB resource control structures look the same. The controlled process is the same, and so is the purpose of the overall control structure, to establish consensus on the state of ownership and chain of custody of resources. The controllers are also the same. Just as wild pack animals are comprised of members and physical power projectors, post-Paleolithic society is also comprised of members and abstract power projectors. Similarly, just as physical power functions as controller with control authority over members and power projectors, so too does abstract power function as a controller and wield control authority over sapiens. Consequently, both resource control techniques have the same overall shape and structure. A clear difference between systems is the type of power used. Whereas wild animals use physical power, watts, to establish control authority over resources, post-Paleolithic sapiens attempt to use imaginary or abstract power, rank, to establish control authority over resources. Sapiens use their large neocortices to create an imaginary source of power within their collective minds called rank, and then they nominate different people to have that rank. These high-ranking abstract power projectors are formally granted control authority over society's resources via formally codified rules of law, allowing them to approve or deny people's access to society's resources, as well as change the state of ownership of those resources. For example, the state of ownership of dry land is usually controlled by government executives or ministries. Civilians, that is members, within modern society must request access to that land, and government officials approve or deny those requests. Major differences between physical and abstract power-based resource control systems have been enumerated and highlighted in different colors. Beginning with the control actions highlighted in purple, the first of 4 enumerated control actions worth noting for its differences is the subscribe control action executed by members and power projectors. Members and power projectors within APB systems subscribe to the control authority of abstract power, just like they do within PPB systems. What makes this control action appreciably different is the fact that it's implicitly voluntary, whereas members and power projectors of PPB systems do not have the ability to unsubscribe from the control authority of watts. Members and power projectors of APB systems do have the ability to unsubscribe from the control authority of rank. People can simply choose to be unsympathetic to rank by ignoring it or refusing to believe in it, whereas it is physically impossible to ignore or be uninfluenced by real-world physical power. The second of 4 enumerated control actions worth noting for its systemic differences is the request in ranking control action executed by power projectors. Whereas physical power projectors receive their physical power passively via natural sortition and actively via engineering ingenuity, abstract power projectors receive their rank passively via things like rhetoric, enforcement, and rules of law. They run for election, or they climb their way up an existing hierarchy to achieve the rank they desire. People don't achieve their rank unless it's passed on to them, hence the practice of bloodlines and inbreeding, or randomly unless sortition is codified into the rule of law. Romans used to do this to mitigate the threat of corrupt people abusing their rank. US does this using concepts like jury duty. The third of 4 enumerated control actions worth noting is the N-rank control action executed by power. Instead of being physically empowered, power projectors within APB resource control systems are merely enranked. As discussed previously, abstract power projectors don't have real, that is physical power. The last of 4 enumerated control actions worth noting is the change abstract state control action executed by abstract power projectors. Because abstract power projectors don't have physically real power, they cannot physically change the state of ownership and chain of custody of resources in shared objective physical reality. They can only change the abstract state of ownership of resources. In other words, high-ranking people can claim that a piece of property you physically control access to doesn't belong to you, but they can't physically gain access to or physically deprive you from having access to it. Thus, the ability of abstract power projectors to change the state of ownership and chain of custody of agrarian resources is symbolic only. They are actually physically powerless to do this. Another noteworthy difference between physical versus abstract power projectors is that abstract power projectors can't execute the same control actions as physical power projectors can. Whereas physical power projectors can physically gain access to resources and physically defend access to resources, abstract power projectors can do neither of these things. The same flaw of imaginary power keeps appearing in different ways. High-ranking people are physically powerless. Physical power hierarchies are inclusive, but abstract power hierarchies aren't. The different characteristics of physical power watts, and abstract power, rank, lead to several different complex emergent properties between PPB and APB dominance hierarchies and resource control structures. There are at least 3 major differences worth noting for this theory. The first of 3 major differences between PPB dominance hierarchies and APB dominance hierarchies is that physical power hierarchies are inclusive to everyone, whereas abstract power hierarchies aren't. Everybody has access to watts and can effectively vote with them. Everyone can swing a fist, swing a blade, pull a trigger, solve a hash function, or do a host of other things to use physical power to represent their interests. This makes physical power hierarchies highly representative of the will of the people who choose to use it. In contrast, abstract power is non-inclusive. Few people get to have rank, and not everyone gets the right to vote. Instead, only an extremely small sample of the population gets to have rank required to vote on their rules, making the system far less representative of the will of the people who choose to use rank rather than watts. In this sense, terms like representative democracy are oxymorons akin to terms like the People's Republic, because a very small number of votes, 0.0001% in the case of the US representative democracy, is, statistically speaking, not a highly representative sample size of the population's beliefs and interests. Physical power hierarchies give everyone unbounded power, but abstract power hierarchies don't. A second major systemic difference between physical power, watts, and abstract power, rank hierarchies is that watts are unbounded and non-zero sum, whereas rank is bounded and zero sum. There is no theoretical limit to the amount of physical power honest people can use to represent and secure their interests. In contrast, there is a hard mathematical limit to how much rank people can use to represent and secure their interests. This systemic difference is especially relevant in voting systems because it makes voting systems simple to systemically exploit. For example, the resources and interests of 330 million Americans is controlled by less than 1,000 high-ranking people. This means Americans are limited to the abstract power of less than 1,000 people to represent and secure their interests. If the majority of those 1,000 high-ranking people collude at the expense of the people they ostensibly represent, then 330 million people are mathematically guaranteed not to be able to overturn their vote. They can't access more rank, and they can't outvote or overturn collusion, resulting in a state of systemic oppression which can only be solved via physical confrontation, hence why republics and democracies descend into civil wars and revolutions. This security vulnerability occurs because all abstract power hierarchies and voting systems are trust-based and permission-based systems. People must necessarily trust that their representatives will use their rank to represent public interests rather than their own personal interests, because they are physically powerless to stop them, as well as mathematically incapable of countervailing a regulatorily captured voting system. People must operate based on the tacit permission of a small number of high-ranking people who control the majority vote, because otherwise people are both mathematically and physically incapable of adding more votes to impeach the colluding members' codified control authority. If there is no way to impeach the control authority of majority or unanimous voters, then it's technically a trust-based and permission-based system where a centralized ruling party has irrevocable control authority. Cicero famously called this design feature out. Great is the power, great is the authority of a Senate that is unanimous in its opinions. Physical power hierarchies can't be systemically exploited, but abstract power hierarchies can. A third major systemic difference between physical power, aka watts, hierarchies and abstract power, aka rank hierarchies, is that watts are exogenous to people's belief systems and therefore invulnerable to systemic exploitation, whereas abstract power is endogenous to people's belief systems and therefore vulnerable to systemic exploitation. In other words, rank exists internally within the system it's used. The control authority associated with rank is formally codified by rulemakers, and so are the logical constraints. That means lawmakers can simply change the rules or write exploitable logic to gain, maintain, and abuse their abstract power. Rulemakers can meddle with the rules, bait and switch the rules, or deliberately design their logic to have exploitable properties which benefit one group of people at the expense of others. Rulemakers can design the rules to award themselves with more voting power than other people, or they can make one side's rank and votes carry more mathematical weight and control authority than another side's rank and votes by simply changing the logic of the voting system. With discrete mathematical precision, rulemakers can design loopholes, backdoors, trapdoors, and zero days into the system's design logic, which nullify people's ability to represent and secure themselves. They can award themselves with veto power. They can exploit voting protocols via gerrymandering or counterfeiting or other common forms of fraud. There are many ways abstract power can be systemically exploited, and there are many ways to deliberately design rules of law so that they are intentionally exploitable without detection from the public. Physical power, on the other hand, is impossible to systemically exploit in this manner because nobody has the capacity to write any of the rules. What's are systemically exogenous and fully independent from anybody's belief system or any rule set designed or encoded by any person for that matter. Physical power exists in an ontologically separate plane of knowledge than abstract power, predating human-made constructs like rank and authority by at least 14 billion years. It's impossible to counterfeit Watts. It's impossible to meddle with the properties of Watts or bait and switch Watts. It's impossible to gerrymander Watts. There is no way to veto someone's Watts or make one person's Watts carry more weight than another person's Watts. There is no way to ignore someone's Watts. Nobody with any amount of rank can escape from the effects of Watts. Being unsympathetic to Watts doesn't negate the effect of Watts. There's no way to manipulate the logic of Watts to subversively encode exploitable backdoors or trapdoors. Watts are free from the risk of meddling, interference, mismanagement, and abuse. For these and many more reasons, Watts produce a systemically secure technique for people to represent their will, resolve their disputes, and reach consensus on the legitimate state of ownership and chain of custody of their resources.